Chapter 202. The demonic fish's carefully prepared counterattack was effective. Just as it had expected, the huge gap between its psionic ability and the young blue dragon's psionic ability suddenly collapsed, and the young blue dragon was nailed to the ground by the dragon-type immobilization spell. What a different young blue dragon, the demonic fish thought to itself. If it had not learned this skill from a certain priest who liked to slay dragons, it would have been the one to die. But it's just right to be transformed into the perfect fighter on land and in the sky. It used its tentacles to push aside the armored monsters in front of it that blocked its view. According to the priest's memory, the spell passed down from the deity that the demonic fish hated could last for at least 1/6 of an hourglass, so it had time to admire its work. With a loud boom, the 3 egg-shaped eyeballs on its head were blasted into pieces by a super-large crossbow bolt embedded with a large amount of explosives. Sitting in the audience seat, Nera the ogre was not content to just be a spectator. When Keys started a fight with the demonic fish, the weapon master had already assembled a new weapon that he had never tested before. A stand with 3 claws was wedged into the flat platform to create a stable launching platform. A crossbow that was huge even in the hands of an ogre was placed on the stand and fastened firmly with hinges and bolts. With the help of a steam pressurizing device, the bowstring made of 3 strands of steel wire was slowly pulled open by Neru to the point where it could be fired. When he realized that Keys was in a disadvantageous position in a head-on battle, Neru immediately aimed at the target with his scope and smashed the trigger button. Propelled by both the bowstring and the steam, the large bolt with the tail was shot straight at the monster's head. The streamlined body of the arrow allowed the weapon to fly smoothly and quietly. The demonic fish did not even hear the sound of the arrow piercing through the air before its head exploded. If it wasn't for the defensive force field spell of the last moment, the demonic fish wouldn't have just been blinded by the arrow fragments after the explosion. Perhaps its entire head would have been pierced through by the crossbow arrow. The pain came later than expected. Due to the enormous kinetic energy of the arrow, even with the force field spell as a buffer, the impact was no less than a battering ram hitting the demonic fish's head. Therefore, the first thing it felt was the dizziness caused by the concussion, followed by the intense pain caused by the explosion of its eyeballs. Kill them. The demonic fish that was completely blind let out a strange sound again. It ordered its underlings to take action. Go and corrupt that megalosaurus. The first order was easy to understand and was immediately carried out by the monsters. It was as if they had forgotten the pain caused by the terrifying ogre not long ago. They swarmed towards the ogre again. But the second order was obviously much more complicated than the first. Only a few of the demonic fish's followers, the first batch of high-level armored monsters hatched in the Ash world, could fully understand it. The high-level armored monsters had a larger body and sharper brain nerves than their offspring. It was precisely because of this that they felt more pain when carrying out the orders of their masters. But orders were orders, and they had to be carried out. Dozens of high-level armored monsters that had been hiding fell out of the mucus cloud. They used their large pincers to peel off the shells of the demonic fish that had been soaked in the mucus secreted by the demonic fish. At the same time, they let out ear-piercing screams because their companions were tearing them apart. Once these shells were peeled off, the high-level armored monsters would dip their bodies in blue blood and draw strange runes on the surface. The large amount of mucus adhered to the shells made it easy for them to stick them into a huge dice cup. Because it had lost its eyes, the demonic fish could only bow down and let the slaves work together to move the prop used to corrupt the young blue dragon and put it in its tentacles. Show me the position. Although the demonic fish had used its psionic power to cut off its sense of pain, it still had to endure the pain of dizziness. It tried its best to send out a clear order. When the corruption ritual is activated, you have to guard me carefully. The group of high-level armored beasts tapped their pincers twice, using this method to express their obedience and affirmation. Their blind master, on the other hand, wrapped the dice cup made of shells with his tentacles and raised it to cover the young blue dragon. It sounded complicated, but in fact, this series of actions happened in a very short period of time. Even Key's companions did not have time to react. The cunning demonic fish had completed a comprehensive plan. Damn it! Seeing the monster that had just injured raise the dice cup, the brawny ogre hurriedly fired the giant crossbow for the second time. Unfortunately, the demonic fish, which had suffered a great loss, was prepared. The force field that had spread out caused the giant crossbow to lose its aim. Keys is in danger. We have to do something quickly. Gourmet Brew did not have the mood to play with the half-dead armored monsters. He immediately turned into a gaseous state and flew up to the sky to support the young blue dragon, which Dr. Paru waved the troll's skull and spread a large amount of thick acid fog to cover the monsters that were rushing toward them. After being teleported into the grand arena, Paladin Jensen, who had not had a sense of presence, also raised his round shield and poured a large amount of sacred power into it. He was going to use his special skill, Shield Bash, evil slashing slash, to save his employer. Gel Evolution Technique. The advantage of having 4 tentacles was that when one tentacle was used, the other 3 could be used. Other than the one that had rolled up the sieve of decay and aimed at Keys, the other 3 tentacles of the demonic fish reached out and touched the bodies of the 3 saltwater colloid monsters that were under its control. Under the influence of the spell, the saltwater colloid monsters that were touched produced a large amount of gel in their bodies. They instinctively attracted their own kind to fuse into their bodies. 1, 2, 3. The saltwater colloid monsters that were originally piled up together fused with each other. In a few breaths, they expanded and evolved into a new type of gel monster. These monsters looked somewhat like large water elementals, but their bodies flowed with highly corrosive acidic gel. They were no longer boxy like the saltwater colloid monsters. Their faces had also become similar to facial features. In the face of these monsters, the attacks of Paladin Jensen and Ogre Neru did not have the desired effect. Shield Bash, evil slashing slash, futilely pierced through the opponent's body. After losing a large amount of kinetic energy, it fell into the puddles on the ground and turned into a shield that shone with sacred power. Although the heavy crossbow caused an explosion and blew the gel monster into several pieces, each piece of the gel monster spontaneously attracted its own kind nearby and turned into a monster that was only slightly smaller in size. Although the demonic fish could not see, there was a savage smile on its face. Chapter 203. Unlike the demonic fish that was laughing heartily, the monsters that served it were attracted by the strange phenomenon in the sky. The sun that was shining on the ground was covered by dark clouds that came out of nowhere. The environment in the grand arena became a little gloomy because of the dim light. Of course, gloomy was only for the monsters. When Key's friends saw the Leviathan descending from the sky to support them, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. I was careless and got hit. The young blue dragon, who had spent a lot of effort to break free from the dragon-type spell's effect, twisted his stiff neck and looked at the demonic fish that had just cast a spell on him. Then he whispered to himself, "It's impolite not to reciprocate." He stretched out both arms and waved them down at the same time. The 2 flagella on the Leviathan that was hovering at a low altitude quickly transformed into 2 thick tentacles. According to Keys's command, the 2 tentacles quickly swept towards the monsters in the grand arena. Seeing this, the gelatinous monsters that wanted to attack the audience immediately changed their direction. They moved towards the tentacles of the Leviathan while absorbing more saltwater gelatinous monsters to increase their weight. The spell of the demonic fish had made them undergo a comprehensive physiological evolution. The gelatinous monsters that had a certain level of intelligence wanted to use the growth of their body to delay the attack of the Leviathan so that their master could think of a countermeasure to delay the attack of the Leviathan. But how could Keys let them do as they wished? He chanted a short spell in Draconic and pointed his finger at the gelatinous monsters that were trying to grab the tentacles of the Leviathan. The young blue dragon summoned a large number of earth elements and poured them into the body of the gelatinous monsters without hesitation. Not long after, The bodies of the monsters that were transformed by the demonic fish were filled with heavy earth elements. Their bodies turned from colorless and transparent to dark brown. Mud to stone, the young blue dragon once again cast a new spell. The mud in the body of the gelatinous monsters quickly solidified and turned into sandy rocks. Dozens of gelatinous monster sculptures of various sizes appeared in the grand arena. In fact, the mud to stone spell instinctively turned the mud into hard granite, but Keys had changed a few nodes in the spell structure, turning it into a softer sandstone. Bang, 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 bang. Under the sweep of the Leviathan's thick tentacles, the gelatinous monsters that had turned into sculptures were smashed into pieces one after another. As their bodies were no longer made of gel, this kind of damage naturally could not be avoided by assimilation and recombination. The monsters that had just been created were defeated one by one. If the demonic fish did not react to such a change, they would not be known for their cunning. Although it could not immediately heal its eyes, it could still use its psionic power, part of its sensory organs, to see the surroundings. In particular, the floating behemoth that appeared above his head was especially shocking. What kind of monster is this? The young blue dragon did not have the obligation to answer its question. In fact, after defeating the gelatinous monsters, Keys ordered the Leviathan to extend its deadly tentacles to the leader of the monsters. The tentacles swung and hit the deflected force field, making a sound like leather being beaten. But the demonic fish that was protected by spells and mucus clouds did not suffer any damage this time. Keys frowned. The Leviathan sent a message to him through the spiritual link. Master, the strange fish is trying to use its ability to enslave me. As expected, the monster was always used to using its natural ability. But the brain of the Leviathan was similar to the distributed layout of an insect. There were many sub-brains in the body, which made the demonic fish's enslavement method ineffective. Let the kobolds put organic matter into the furnace. Keys was a little tired of the repeated back and forth. He ordered the Leviathan to make the final attack. Fuel cell, start charging. Prepare for electric shock. Black oil mixed with a certain proportion of coal and starch was thrown into the stomach of the Leviathan by the kobold pilots. The biological furnace started to work. The produced hydrogen was sent into the fuel cell-like organ in the body of the behemoth. Electricity began to accumulate. Spikes with a metallic glow grew from the tip of the Leviathan's tentacles. Flashing electric arcs lingered on the spikes. Seeing this, the demonic fish quickly set up a protective force field around itself. At the same time, it cast a spell to make itself immune to electric shock. After charging, the Leviathan plunged 2 of its tentacles into the puddles in the grand arena. Except for the demonic fish that took good care of itself, the other monsters under its command were all convulsing because of the electric shock. The voltage of more than 1,000,000 volts easily penetrated the salty puddles. Even the armored monsters wrapped in chitin carapace were not spared. A large number of monsters fell into the puddles before they could even struggle. Young blue dragon, electric shock does not work on me. That being said, the demonic fish still used its psionic ability to wrap the cloud of mucus and pull itself out of the water. I have seen through your stupid plan, and I will eventually win. Cunning guy. Keys could not help but complain. The demonic fish was wasting its saliva, talking nonsense on the surface, but in fact, its words were mixed with an obscure spell. It wanted to repeat the same trick and launch a surprise attack on the young blue dragon with the dragon-type immobilization spell. But Keys was obviously prepared. Before the other party's spell was formed, he used advanced dispel magic to break it. At the same time, he made a quick retreat, gesture to his companions with his hands behind his back. The first to receive the signal was the ogre blue. In order to rescue Keys, he turned into a gaseous body and floated near the young blue dragon. Seeing Keys' gesture, the astute ogre immediately flew out of the grand arena while shouting to his 2 brothers and the paladin Jensen in secret language. Retreat. It seems that your companions have abandoned you. The demonic fish noticed the people in the audience seats and saw them climb over the highest wall of the grand arena, climbing down and quickly evacuating outside. Surrender or be destroyed. You have to make a choice now. He really couldn't figure out the current situation. After hearing these words, the young blue dragon even began to doubt the knowledge related to the demonic fish race has very high IQ in the dragon inheritance. In fact, the high IQ of this monster was just a reflection of the perfect memory passed down from generation to generation. If there was a situation that they had never encountered before, compared to other races, the demonic fish were not necessarily that smart. After his companions had evacuated, Keys, who could not wait, immediately ordered the Leviathan to climb quickly. Before the floating behemoth flew away, it also discharged the excess hydrogen in its body through its tentacles. Clasping his hands together and using the force field ability inherited from the power dragon, Keys compressed the hydrogen, oxygen, and the hydrogen discharged by the Leviathan into a suitable ratio and stored them around the cloud of the demonic fish's mucus. The monster also felt the tremendous force field pressure. While using its own force field spell to resist, it tried to float up into the air to break free. With its poor knowledge of chemistry, it still did not realize where the real danger was. A fireball was lightly thrown over by Quest. The mixture of hydrogen and oxygen that was close to a ratio of 2:1 instantly exploded, and the dazzling flames soared into the sky along the pillar formed by the force field walls. Chapter 204. The skin of the demonic fish was actually a kind of thick membrane-like tissue with multiple layers. It was too dense to be called mucus, and it was too soft to be called skin. This kind of membrane tissue was similar to percolating rubber. It had amazing elasticity and ductility, far tougher than the skin of ordinary creatures. It was very difficult to cut and penetrate. When it was filled and supported by the bones of the demonic fish, it provided a good natural armor. Thanks to this layer of natural armor, the hydrogen gas detonated by Keys did not directly take its life. However, the hot flames still licked every inch of its skin, and the mucus that was tightly wrapped around its body evaporated. The dry skin caused great pain to the demonic fish, and its strength was also greatly weakened. Its hearing and vision were not affected, but its sense of touch and smell were lost. It had fallen into a semi-dormant state that was named by scholars who had studied this race as the long dream. In this state, although the demonic fish could think and observe, it was unable to carry out any actions, not even the mental activity of its psionic ability. The salted fish has turned over. Looking at the demonic fish lying on the cracked ground and breathing in the salty air, the young blue dragon curled his lips in disgust. It's still a salted fish. Not long after, the culprit that started the monster tide and invaded Taka City was firmly surrounded by the city guards who rushed over after the big explosion. Thanks to the results achieved by Keys and his companions, all the monsters near the salt factory spontaneously retreated quickly and returned to the depths of the salt lake to hide. In the consul's mansion, the old emir, who had the curse removed, smiled. Thanks to Lord Pasha's help, Taka City was saved from being occupied by the monsters. Keys naturally knew that the consul was just being polite. In fact, even if he did not do anything, the sorcerers of Medici could eventually drive the demonic fish away. But by then, the price that the emir family had to pay would not be as simple as a permanent most favored purchase agreement and a reward of 100,000 silver cats. Pharaoh might hold him responsible for the loss of land and take back the authority to govern Taka City from him. Everyone was happy with the current situation, except for a few members of the noble observation team, who had alighted from the Leviathan, who complained a little. The process of the floating behemoth's rapid descent and ascent was not a pleasant ride. In order to celebrate Taka City's victory against the monster invasion, Emil held a grand banquet in his mansion to entertain the distinguished guests who had come from afar. Because of Keys, Gnome's envoys were also invited to attend this banquet. The blazing flames in the fireplace, the finely brewed malt beer, and the roasted lamb chops smeared with spices and specialty powdered salt warmed the wet bodies of the envoys who had just experienced the Mocha Monster crisis and soothed their nervous emotions. Blue the ogre, who did not care about other people's gazes, volunteered to be the chef and cooked steam-powered dishes made from the armored monsters on the spot. But only Keys and his companions dared to try his cooking. In order to show his respect to Keys, the Pasha of the Megalosaurus, Emil specially asked his son to bring out his beloved antique furniture from the family collection. It was a huge walnut round table inlaid with shiny shells and gems, accompanied by a dozen high-backed chairs. The surface of the table was meticulously treated with varnish. Under Emil's persuasion, the young blue dragon sat at the main seat, while the consul of Taka City and the other nobles took their seats around the round table. Compared to the dishes on the tables of the other participants, the food on the main seat was undoubtedly more sumptuous. There were wild boar ribs smeared with beer, roasted camel meat, roasted lamb chops, sizzling roasted horse loins, bread drizzled with delicious soup, as well as finely brewed malt beer, grape wine, jujube, sweet rice wine, and so on. A dazzling array of food filled the entire table. Unlike the other nobles who were drinking and laughing at the main table, Keys looked at the table with a slightly displeased expression. Consul Tuka, who was a smooth and slick person, immediately noticed this. After pondering for a while, he figured out the reason behind it. What's going on? I remember that the monsters did not invade this mansion. Did my food storage suffer any losses? After saying this to the butler beside him, the old Emil slightly pointed at the other tables with his chin. Everyone here is my distinguished guest. How can I favor one and discriminate against the other? Like master, like servant. Emil's butler immediately understood and said, Master, please be understanding. There are a little too many distinguished guests today, and the chefs in the mansion are rushing to prepare. The banquet was filled with distinguished guests, but there were some who ignored it and would rather be absent than busy in secret. Lilith of the Obsidian Council strolled into the backyard of the consul's mansion. Because he had cast an illusion spell on himself, none of the servants and attendants who passed by him noticed this noble mage who was strolling around without permission. He was looking for the catch of the young blue dragon. With his knowledge as a high-level mage, he naturally knew the value of a demonic fish. Seeing that it was sent to the consul's mansion for temporary storage, Lilith could not help but have some thoughts. He knew that the demonic fish was not dead, because a living demonic fish was much more valuable than a dead one. With the greed of the Megalosaurus Pasha, he would definitely not give up on the opportunity to extract knowledge from its brain. Knowledge was power, especially for spellcasters. Lilith believed that as long as there was a little water, the monster that was about to be roasted into a dried salted fish would willingly offer up the knowledge he wanted to obtain. He was very sure of this. The noble mage carefully sniffed the salted fish smell in the air. Suddenly, a slight wave of magic caught his attention. Lilith quickened his pace and walked towards the source of the wave. As it turned out, the Megalosaurus Pasha's request and the orders of the master of the house, the Emil family's mage, was using a special method to temporarily deal with the demonic fish. With the help of his apprentices, the elderly mage wrapped the demonic fish's body in layers of new bandages while continuously chanting a special spell. Powdered graphite was added between each layer of bandages, and the energy in several obsidian magic orbs had turned into special magic runes that were branded inch by inch on the surface of the bandages. To make it easier to transport, the young blue dragon had cast a shrinking spell on the monster. Compared to its massive size when it first appeared, the demonic fish now looked like a big fish, but it was not as frightening as before. The magic ritual that the family's mage was performing was actually the process of casting the shrinking spell on its body. Seeing that the mage was focused on casting the spell and had no time to pay attention to his surroundings, Lilith immediately softly chanted the incantation for the powerful sleep spell. At the same time, a burst of joy welled up in his heart. Asterisk bang asterisk. Asterisk, two sounds of twin peaks piercing the ear hit Lilith's head. The noble mage did not have time to complete the construction of the spell model for the powerful sleep spell before he fainted. Chapter 205. They said that you used to be gladiator stars in the Grand Colosseum. While everyone was immersed in the celebratory atmosphere, A few children slipped out from under the watchful eyes of the servants and sneaked towards the three ogre brothers who occupied a bonfire. The leader of the group, a little boy, plucked up the courage to strike up a conversation with the friendliest Brew. "What I mean is, how did you defeat that monster?" Brew turned his head and looked at the three little humans who were not even half of his height sitting on the ground. A cunning glint flashed in his eyes as he said in a low voice, "Little children, you should know that we are ogres." After saying that, he licked his fangs with his tongue maliciously. However, before he could say we love eating little people the most, the troll skull gave him a fat slap on the head. Ignore him. Even Brew was a little ashamed of Brew's unscrupulous act of scaring the children. This ogre, who was much bigger than his two brothers, scratched his head and pondered for a moment before explaining to the children. "We are a group. That strange fish only has a bunch of underlings. Hit them hard, and they will die." He pointed at the armored monsters that Brew had just steamed. "And their meat is delicious." The youngest child with the brightest eyes was obviously not satisfied with this answer. He straightened the corner of his linen shirt and plucked up the courage to question. "What we want to ask is, how did you defeat that ugly and smelly fish? Did you throw out a huge fireball? We heard the explosion in the Grand Colosseum during the day, but we did not see it." Rubbing the bulge on his head, Brew looked at the witch Dr. Paru with an aggrieved expression. He purposely put on a stern face and said to the children, "That is a secret spell that cannot be taught to outsiders. It requires special casting materials." He took out a spice box from the gourmet box beside him and threw some chili into his mouth. Like this, while chewing on the chili and patting his bulging belly, Brew opened his mouth and burped. A blazing fireball shot out from the ogre's mouth and exploded in mid-air, blooming into a firework under the night sky. "Amazing! Can you teach us how to release fireballs?" The surrounding children immediately shouted excitedly, but they didn't expect to attract the attendants and etiquette teachers who were anxiously waiting for them. "How dare you sneak out? Hurry up and go back to sleep." This group of naughty boys who had been traveling together at night suddenly became like deflated balloons. They lowered their heads and followed behind their teacher, reluctantly walking out of the banquet hall. Brew happily waved at the children who were saying goodbye to him. He was especially happy about the unexpected prank when he saw the tip of the chili pepper on the palm of the little boy who asked the question. On the balcony of the consul's private office, old Emil watched the little episode between his grandchildren and the three ogre brothers. He chuckled and shook his head helplessly. As a man of old age, he could never understand where the seemingly inexhaustible vigor of children lay. "I want to take good care of them, my children and my people. I want to dedicate myself to them and ensure their safety so that they can focus on their families and daily lives." The consul of Taka City smiled. "I want them to find a partner, have children, and live a good life that every Medici has the right to enjoy." Old Emil felt a trace of fatigue in his voice. Keyes, who was sitting beside him, also heard it. He said, "It sounds like you're a little down, Mr. Consul. If it's because of the demonic fish, you don't have to worry. With the nature of this monster, there shouldn't be another one in the salt lake outside the city." "I'm not worried about that." Old Emil sighed and said with a sincere tone, "The monster is just a temporary problem. It might be able to make the archons of the city anxious, but it's not to the point where the Emil family can't survive." He motioned for the servant in the room to leave for the time being. Then, he lifted a tapestry embroidered with the portrait of his ancestor. Finally, he fiddled with the safe hidden behind the tapestry for a while before taking out several scrolls and documents. "This is an agreement that has been enchanted by my family." The consul handed the scrolls to the Megalosaurus Pasha in front of him. "It ensures that the person who signs the agreement can receive 1/10 of the dividends from the Emil family every year for a period of 100 years. Looking at the blank spot on the scroll, Keyes immediately understood that this was an agreement specially prepared for him. He thought for a moment before asking, "First, tell me what you want to pay. Killing a demonic fish is not worth this much. Taka City needs Leviathan." Old Emil had heard a little about the style of the Megalosaurus Pasha, so he did not beat around the bush and said directly, The lake salt produced by the salt lake has been unable to be sold in the northern part of Medici. That area is the richest land in the entire empire. In the process of competing with sea salt, the lake salt has always been at a disadvantage in terms of price. The reason for this was none other than the high cost of transportation. So I want to sign an agreement with His Excellency Pasha, who has control of the future air transportation route, to use the Emil family's income for the next 100 years in exchange for the right to transport the lake salt of Taka City using the floating behemoth. Seeing that the young blue dragon showed a slightly interested look, he struck while the iron was hot. If it's possible, I don't know if His Excellency Pasha is willing to sell a transportation vehicle like the Leviathan. The Emil family is willing to use more benefits than the agreement in exchange for a transport airship belonging to Taka City. Yes, but the price is not cheap. Keyes had no intention of beating around the bush, so he responded straightforwardly. In fact, the first flight of the Leviathan was a carefully planned roadshow. He wanted to show off to the potential customers who could afford such an expensive transportation vehicle like the floating behemoth to attract their help. As for whether other people had the ability to imitate such a giant synthetic creature, he could not easily make a conclusion. However, as long as the floating behemoth was purchased from a young blue dragon with the Leviathan as the blueprint, the final control was in the young blue dragon's hands. The only problem now was how to quote the price to the old Emil. The governor of Taka City was simply too cooperative. The conditions that Keyes had thought of to purchase the floating behemoth in exchange for benefits were actually written in the agreement just now. What new conditions should he think of? The young blue dragon fell into a short period of contemplation, until an attendant hurriedly knocked on the door outside the office. Old Emil opened the door and listened to the report in a low voice. He could not help but frown. With his extraordinary hearing, Keyes, who also heard the conversation between the master and servant, revealed an imperceptible smile on his face. Chapter 206. A naked man has few secrets, but a man with torn skin has no secrets. Looking at Lilith, whose cheeks were red and swollen and at least 1/3 of his teeth missing, the steampunk half-lich said in a cold tone with the sound of grinding gears. The noble mage knew that he was telling the truth. He had said and done similar things before. Even though he was covered by a robe, as a mage, he could still feel the terrifying aura in his body. It was a kind of aura unique to high-level undead creatures, and mortals would instinctively be afraid of it. Lilith could not imagine what would happen to him in the near future when he was tortured by an undead creature with no feelings and compassion. He kept trying to recite the spell in his memory. In order to cast spells successfully without the help of the obsidian magic bead, the noble mage, who had always been pampered, did not hesitate to directly extract his own vitality. Unfortunately, although Snade looked like he could only use brute force, he was still a half-lich in essence. In front of this expert, Lilith's little trick was not worth mentioning at all. There were too many ways to interfere with a mortal mage's casting of spells, such as the rope that bound his hands was lowered and he was immersed in a large tank filled with water. The horrible feeling of drowning could easily make the noble mage forget the spell in his memory. Or the noble mage could hide an obsidian magic bead in a place where he could feel it, making Lilith think that it was a life-saving straw that had accidentally fallen when he was stripped of his clothes before the interrogation. When he tried to mobilize the soul energy in the bead to cast spells quickly, the noble mage would smash the bead. The failure of casting spells would immediately be reflected on the twisted face of the noble mage. Or the noble mage could simply use a leather whip to whip the hanged prisoner. The low-level pain of torn skin and torn flesh was easily beyond the tolerance limit of the noble. Perhaps this method was too crude. After thinking for a while, Snade took some lake salt, which was a specialty of Taka City, and poured it into the water tank at Lilith's feet. The combination of whipping and soaking in salt water was a perfect combination. It had to be said that, falling into the hands of a half-lich of the drow race who was famous for their torture, the noble mage Liliter really lived up to the saying, "What a pitiful man." Therefore, not long after the interrogation began, He voluntarily signed a confession that was enchanted with magic and could be used to verify its authenticity. I can't imagine. The governor of Taka City changed his usual gentle demeanor and vented his anger on the person in front of him. Sneaking into my mansion with malicious intentions is an act of provocation to the Emir family. One of the Beitar nobles who attended the banquet yesterday was also embarrassed beyond words. However, due to the mission given by the Obsidian Council, he had no choice but to suck it up in front of old Emir. "Your Excellency's anger is indeed understandable," he said, choosing his words carefully as he tried to persuade him. Although Wizard Lilith's actions can indeed be considered as an offense, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that he's challenging the Emil family's prestige. Besides, the Obsidian Council is willing to compensate you. We just hope that you can consider the friendship of the noble class and not pursue the matter too much, so as not to affect the unity of the entire class. First, he admitted his mistake, then proposed to negotiate compensation, and finally threatened the person involved. Even the Megalosaurus Pasha Keys, who was a distinguished guest, could not admit his mistake. This could indeed be called a model of crisis public relations. Unfortunately, compared to the friendship of the Beitar nobles, old Emir favored forming an alliance of interests with the Megalosaurus Pasha, who was closer to him. After patiently listening to the noble's advice, the consul of Taka City said coldly, "According to the ancient law of Medici, the conflict between the nobles can be solved by offering money. But as far as I know, the noble sorcerer named Liliot only has a few manors far away in Bite that I can choose from. It's not a good place to live. Your Excellency, Mr. Liliot is a member of the Obsidian Council, and also a disciple of Master Cook." Keys, who was sitting at the side, interrupted the noble's words. "Actually, Governor Emir has other options. There's an airship of Mr. Liliot outside Gnome City. Although it's not as good as the Leviathan in many aspects, it's still worth a lot." The noble looked at the young blue dragon in shock and instantly protested angrily. "The boat of the Scorching Sun is the property of the Obsidian Council. How dare you make such an assertion? Please be careful with your words." Keys seemed to have narrowed his eyes because the noble did not use honorifics in his words. The governor of Taka City immediately chimed in. "Your words are not respectful to a pasha. Can I take it that you want to provoke another conflict?" At this point, no matter how stupid he was, he understood that there must be an exchange of interest between the Megalosaurus Pasha and the most prominent noble in the southern part of the empire. The noble's lobbyist was speechless for a moment. He stammered and asked to leave. The so-called nobles were just using fear to build a high platform in the hearts of ordinary people to hold up the so-called dignity of the nobles. But when they encountered someone they did not fear at all, this fictitious dignity would always fall from a high place and shatter into pieces. This was especially true for the nobles living in Bite City. They had no real power in the local area. The only thing they relied on was the legal provisions of the Medici Empire that obviously gave preferential treatment to nobles. Unfortunately, just like the difference between nobles and commoners, when dealing with disputes between nobles, the law was always more inclined to protect the rights of those with higher status and real power. Your Excellency Pasha, after sending off the noble's lobbyist, old Emir asked the waiter to bring new tea and snacks. He said to Keys with a smile, "About the ship of the Scorching Sun, there will be a commission agreement for you to handle it on your behalf later." Understanding the meaning behind the words, the young blue dragon also replied without hesitation, "It will take at least half a year to transform the ship of the Scorching Sun into a new floating behemoth. At most, it will take no more than a year. Once it is completed, it will be handed over to Taka City. As a bonus, I will add a set of weapons system to it, turning it into an armed floating merchant ship." Outside Gnome City, the ship of the Scorching Sun docked at the mooring tower immediately became busy after receiving a magical message. All the crew members were making their own preparations for the sudden order to set sail. As the airship had been hovering at a low altitude, the airbags of the airship were not completely filled. The workers in the boiler room were sweating profusely as they filled shovelfuls of coal into the blazing furnace. One of the two wizard apprentices left behind by Lilith had just completed a comprehensive spell investigation of the pod. He did not even have time to rest before he and his companion threw themselves into the work of controlling the synthetic arm. They controlled the giant arm to extend from both sides of the ship and support on the ground, so that it could provide additional support when the airship took off. The soldiers who were still patrolling on the airship were also ordered by their commanding officer to descend to the ground with drooping ropes. Firstly, it was to support their comrades on the ground so that they could form a phalanx that could defend against the enemy. Secondly, it was to reduce some of the load on the airship so that it could take off quickly. Other than fuel, almost all of the food and water were transported to the uppermost deck. At first, they were transported downwards using the drooping ropes, but later they were simply poured downwards. Let the scorching sun take off immediately. The wizard standing at the top of the mooring tower sent a message to his colleagues on the airship. He then quickly hooked a knot on the rope with his foot. There's movement in Gnome City. It seems like an army has left the city. After sending the message, the wizard who had been buffing himself with Eagle Eye immediately recited a spell. He was going to use stone to mud to destroy the entire mooring tower to prevent anyone from climbing up and posing a threat to the airship. Of course, just as these people were working hard for the scorching sun to take off quickly, there were people on other sides who were also working hard in the opposite direction. What a waste. A crew member in a high-ranking officer's uniform muttered to himself as he watched the boatmen throw down the food and water on the deck one after another. As a spy, he had just successfully completed his mission. He had disguised a special potion as wine and sprinkled it on the biologically synthesized arms that stretched out from both sides of the deck. Under the effect of the potion, the giant arms would carry out the opposite orders of the controller. On the distant wall of Gnome City, the brothers One Eye and Crooked Mouth each recited a spell and activated the device installed on the airship's airbags when they sneaked onto the airship for the second time not long ago. Bang! Bang! Two muffled sounds rang out. 2 holes the diameter of a person appeared below the side of the airbags. This time, no matter how much fuel was added to the boiler room, the scorching sun could not rise quickly. The more fuel was added, the more the hot air would expand the holes. Hurry up and start the engine. Maintain cruising at this altitude. After receiving news of the damaged airbags, the airship commander immediately issued a new order. Order the synthetic giant arms to help the airship accelerate. Not long after these 2 orders were issued, 2 pieces of bad news came one after another. The engine installed at the stern of the ship had a small explosion due to fuel residue blocking the pipe. Now the engine could not provide any power. There was also a problem with the giant arms. The wizard apprentice controlling them tried everything he could think of, but the 2 arms seemed to be cast with molten iron. They dug deep into the sand and gradually pulled the airship towards the ground. After receiving the news that the Dragonborn clan had taken over the scorching sun, Keys only ordered them to quickly remove the Olamoki's bucket of waste that he had been longing for a long time. He then devoted himself to the work of extracting the catch from before. In the mind of the mummified demonic fish, the young blue dragon discovered an extremely valuable secret. Chapter 207. Unlike some intelligent creatures who like to gloss over their mistakes and glorify their own race's history, the demonic fish were undoubtedly much fairer in their historical records due to the perfect memory passed down from generation to generation. For example, they objectively retained the original name of the place that they had successfully invaded and had now become their home, the island world. It was a world ruled by the ocean. The mountains that rose from the bottom of the sea formed many islands of various sizes. This was how the island world got its name. The demonic fish were not natives there. They were survivors of a huge empire in a distant foreign world that had been destroyed by many gods. However, when this group of homeless fugitives came to the island world, they quickly discovered that it was their paradise and home. Due to their race's innate ability, the demonic fish race quickly became the overlords at the top of the food chain in the ocean where there were no intelligent aquatic races. After basically grasping the ruling power of the ocean, they followed the ancient tradition and once again spread their forces to the land. Unsurprisingly, the demonic fish met their opponents. In the process of conquering the continent, the 5 highly intelligent land races, the camel people, the humans, the walrus people, the polar bear people, and the penguin people, became their enemies at the same time. In the first 1,000 years of struggle, the few forces each had their own strengths and weaknesses. The demonic fish not only knew how to use powerful spells and psionic abilities, but also had a large number of aquatic monsters that had been modified by them. The land races had the blessings of the spirits of their ancestors due to their ancestor worship, as well as a strong military that used steel as armor and weapons. When the war was at a stalemate, the smart and cunning demonic fish made full use of their advantages. They belonged to the same race, while the land races only had a loose alliance because of their different races. The 7 oldest and strongest demonic fish, who had already grown 7 pairs of gill holes, gathered together and formed the 7 Gills Council. With the power of the entire clan as one, they began to destroy the races on the land one by one. From the very beginning, the demonic fish's target was the weakest penguin tribes. The penguin people lived in the floating ice island at the southernmost part of the island world. Unlike the polar bear people who lived in the northern part of the island world, they had little to no contact with the outside world. They would only occasionally trade with the walrus people who sailed here to exchange for some metal weapons. These human-like creatures with wedge-shaped fins, double-layered scaled feathers, and thick subcutaneous fat were completely adapted to the local living environment. Other than catching krill in the cold ocean for food, they also learned how to cut open the hard ice floes and build their own cities. Every floating ice city had a large greenhouse under it. The penguin people used the heat and nutrients in their feces to cultivate mushrooms and moss as their daily food. They had been living happily on the floating ice island until the terrifying demonic fish started attacking all the land creatures. But the demonic fish to the floating ice island. In several wars against the invasion of the monster army, even if they fought in the ocean, the demonic fish's monsters would move slowly due to the cold water. The penguin people with the floating to ice island always won. Unfortunately, the demonic fish banded together. The 7 Gills Council gathered the wisdom of these ancient species. They came up with a series of conspiracies against the penguin people tribes. First, they used the enslaved walrus people to spread rumors in different floating to ice island cities. After a long time, they finally succeeded in inciting internal strife among the penguin people. Then they extended an olive branch to some of the weaker floating to ice island cities. They quickly suppressed the prestige of the Emperor Penguin People tribe, who originally had the right to speak among the penguin people tribes. In the end, using a premeditated attack from both inside and outside, he sent monsters to murder a large number of emperor penguins and successfully defeated the centralized power system that had been developed for 1,000 years. The tribal power of the penguins fell apart. Since then, the fallen penguins had all become the puppets of the demonic fish, willingly sacrificing their lives for another great undertaking of their new master. The giant magic circle that was proposed by a 7-guild counselor and operated for more than 50 years was activated with the various floating ice cities as nodes. The power of magic tore apart the floating ice islands, and the pulse of elements gushed out from the Earth's core. In just over 10 days, the entire huge island of ice had completely melted. The sea level of the entire island world rose rapidly. Countless islands were drowned. By the time the other land races realized the danger, it was already too late. The cunning demonic fish only used 100 years of planning. They did not expend a single soldier to destroy the backbone of the island world's resistance against them, the humans, as well as the civilized countries built by the humans. In the face of the great disaster known as the Great Cataclysm, any living creature appeared extremely weak. The ancestral holy spirits that the humans worshipped tried to save the world. Unfortunately, they did not even have weak divine powers. They were powerless in the face of the monstrous waves. Coupled with the drowning of a large number of believers, they lost the support of the power of faith. Those weak gods ended up like their believers. After a fruitless struggle, they walked towards death one after another. Only the camel people, who lived in the highlands of the island world, and the polar bear people, who lived on the North Sea thick solid island, escaped the disaster. One learned from the painful experience after the great cataclysm and established a unified empire. The other absorbed the walrus people and penguin people, who were not enslaved by the demonic fish, and formed a united state. The humans, who originally had the highest level of civilization but had a far cry from the other races, were not so lucky, as they could neither integrate into the camel people's empire nor the polar bear people's federation. The remaining humans who had lost their homes could only struggle to make a living on the sea. After hundreds of years, the exiled survivors became a kind of people on the raft. They only went to the land twice a year. They traded on the land ruled by the Empire and the Federation in exchange for logs to build rafts. The rest of the day, they drifted with the waves of the sea and could not see the land at all. In the beginning, the demonic fish would send its aquatic monsters to attack and encircle the people on the raft. But later, the Council of Seven Gills did not have the time to think about this problem, because their main targets were the rising camel people's empire and the polar bear people's federation. For the latter, the demonic fish could still send monsters to land on the thick solid island from time to harass them. But how to curb the development of the former became a big problem that troubled the Council of Seven Gills. After the Great Cataclysm, the highlands where the camel people lived became the largest island in the island world. The increase of the sea area brought abundant rainfall. The scattered oases in the desert joined together to form a huge grassland. The camel people cultivated on this grassland and bred for generations. After more and more camel people were born and accepted the worship of their ancestors, they brought abundant power of faith to their original weak ancestral spirit, the camel god. In exchange, the camel god also taught the priests in the empire more divine spells, including how to create a new desert. In addition to the central oasis, the camel people set up a large number of totems around the huge island where they lived. These totems could not only absorb the fertility of the land to supply the central oasis, but also build a desert area about 100 miles deep around the entire island. The servant army transformed by the demonic fish was all aquatic monsters. They could not cross such a long moat at all. After brainstorming, the Council of Seven Gills decided to send a member to other worlds that were dominated by desert environments to find species that were more suitable for the desert environment to transform and reproduce, expand the army, and thus lead the camel people's empire. For this reason, the Council of Seven Gills spent 10 years and more energy constantly using magic to find a suitable world. Finally, 2 years ago, they successfully sent a member to the Ash World, and this counselor had fallen into the young blue dragon's hands. Chapter 208. On the vast sea, the strong wind rolled up the dark clouds. Between the dark clouds and the sea, there was a small boat traveling alone. The boat was not built with old logs or driftwood on the sea, but with solid wood nailed firmly. The gaps between the planks were filled with lint and asphalt, and its solid masts and sails with hanging pulleys ensured that a person could easily drive it forward in the storm. The hull of the boat was also a scale-like structure, and it was nailed with grapefruit planks one by one. Such strength was enough to sail freely in the most complicated sea. Every part of the boat was delicate and solid, so when it passed through the waves, there was only a slight squeak in the sound of the waves hitting the bow of the boat. Of course, although the boat was good, in fact, sailing the sea depends on the helmsman. The real reason why it was safe and sound in the storm was actually the young blue dragon who was in charge. Under Keys's persuasion with his psionic power, the generous benthic demon fish counselor revealed the complete plane coordinates of the island world in a few days. And after repeated screening by the young blue dragon, he was convinced that in the memory of the benthic demon fish, the island world had not given birth to a real god. Even the camel god, whom the Council of Seven Gills was quite afraid of, had not reached the threshold of a weak divine power. He relied on signing a contract with a powerful person in the elemental plane, and his priest was able to use divine spells to transform the landscape and create deserts on a large scale. In the multiverse, there was almost no material plane like the world of ashes, which was hated by the gods. Although the island world had ancestor worship, it was not organized well and lacked guidance for believers, so there was not even a primitive god. After learning this news, Keyes immediately realized the value of the island world. The young blue dragon was confident that he could make a lot of money by directly taking a share of the sea and land hegemony of the island world, or by contacting the indigenous civilizations that suffered from the benthic demon fish's invasion, and promoting the cross-plane trade of the scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce through his own strength. After making the necessary preparations, Keyes bought clothes made of shark lizard skin, assembled a small boat for navigation, and calibrated the time of the cross-plane summoning spell with the half-lich Snade. Then, he directly teleported from the Leviathan to the island world. Unsurprisingly, in this plane that was dominated by the sea, the young blue dragon appeared in a vast sea called the Open Sea. Thanks to the knowledge of the plane extracted from the benthic demon fish counselor, Keyes did not spend too much time to locate himself. At this time, he was disguised as an ordinary mortal wanderer, steering the boat to the nearest human settlement. In order to make himself look more like the natives of this world, Keyes also caught some sea fish and put them in the cabin. With this ballast, the sturdy boat sailed more stably when passing through the waves. The young blue dragon in human form stood upright next to the mast. The strong wind blew in his face, and the raindrops flowed down the shark lizard skin clothes and into the cabin. However, he appeared to be very comfortable. In fact, Keyes really enjoyed the pleasure of learning to sail in the storm. In the beginning, Keyes could not grasp the angle of the sail well, and the hull would always tilt involuntarily. If not for the protection of the force field control ability, this small boat from a distant foreign plane would have capsized many times. However, after grasping the general rules of the sail angle and learning how to lean out of the cabin and adjust the center of gravity to maintain the balance of the entire hull, it was time for the young blue dragon to truly enjoy the pleasure of sailing. With the help of the ropes and pulleys, the sail was easily adjusted to the most suitable angle. Whether it was with the wind or against the wind, the triangular sail could be fully inflated, driving the small boat forward with the help of the wind. In the storm, Quess and his small boat were like sea swallows, swordfish, or any other unyielding creature that could enjoy the joy of the violent storm, speeding through the vast sea. Of course, at this time, not everyone was as carefree as him. For those who did not have the ability to resist the power of nature, the storm was like the roar of a demon, and the rain was like the venom of a demon that cleansed the soul. Help! Keyes had previously asked Snader to cast a glib tongue spell on him, so he could understand the cry for help in the storm. He adjusted the sail and steered the boat toward the place where the voice came from. A half-grown boy crouching on a canoe made of reeds appeared in the young blue dragon's vision. Judging from the fishskin clothes he was wearing, he should be a fisherman who made a living in the sea all year round. Keyes carefully controlled his boat and approached the soaked boy who was hugging the reed boat and desperately begging for help. He bent down, grabbed the little fisherman by the shoulders, and moved him into his boat. "Thank you. Thank you." The boy was in a trance for a moment before he realized that he had been rescued. He looked at Keyes, who was wearing a thick armor made of shark lizard skin, which was very similar to the skin of a shark in the sea. He hesitated for a moment, and then took out a few metal discs from a small leather bag hanging around his neck and handed them to Keyes. "These are all I have. The circular base is not far from here, so it should be enough to pay for the boat fare to send me back." The thin metal discs called steel coins by the boy were not the hexahedral steel currency commonly used in the Shuraba in the lower plains. Instead, they were a kind of currency that could be used by the surviving people on the raft, the Empire, and the Federation after the catastrophe in the island world. Compared to the highly developed human countries, although they had hundreds of years of development, The Camel Empire and the Polar Bear People's Federation could not compare with the former human countries in terms of metal smelting. Steel was still a scarce resource for them. Of course, the people on the raft, whose civilization had been cut off, did not have the ability to smelt metal. Every year, during the process of drifting with the ocean currents, they would occasionally have the opportunity to salvage some steel objects from the ancient human countries at the bottom of the shallow sea. They would first scrape off the rust on the surface and then cut them into valuable steel coins. In the beginning, the people on the raft would use this currency when trading with the camel people and the polar bear people. But later, steel became scarce, and the surviving human beings consciously controlled the outflow of this currency. They would use the steel coins as a symbol of wealth. After collecting enough steel coins and smelting them, they could cast some steel weapons and tools, which were undoubtedly very useful for people who made a living on the sea. Keyes did not accept the boat fare the boy handed to him. He just picked up a steel coin, looked at it, and returned it. "Show me the location of the circular base. I want to go there to buy supplies." Chapter 209. After giving the fisherman boy an ordinary knife, he quickly became familiar with Keyes. Not only did he tell Keyes his name, Koss, but he also gave his canoe to the generous captain. The raft made of bundled reeds turned out to be a separate floating raft from Koss' catamaran fishing boat. The storm had destroyed his fishing boat that was full of fish. The experienced navigator decisively chose to abandon the boat that was already heavily flooded and escaped with the floating raft. Taking advantage of the moment after the storm stopped, the nimble boy used the spare wood and hemp rope on Keyes' boat to make a simple outboard bracket. He then set up his reed raft to provide extra buoyancy for the boat. "Praise your generosity, Captain." Koss skillfully tied the knot while looking up and smiled at the young blue dragon. "Although this reed raft is worthless, it can make your sailing more stable. And you have an iron knife, so I can tie a dead buckle. My fishing boat disintegrated in the storm because I could only tie a live buckle." After all, he still had the temperament of a teenager. After getting familiar with Keyes, Koss had been talking nonstop. The young blue dragon, who wanted to get more information about the island world, also became a qualified listener. He only asked a few questions occasionally. "This open sea is about to border with the territory of the camels. Your circular base has drifted here this year, so it should be time to trade with them. How many days are you going to stay here?" Keyes asked curiously. This question seemed to show that Keyes was a stowaway, but it was not unexpected. In fact, although the trade fair between the Empire and the Federation did not prohibit other human forces other than the circular base of the floating raft people from participating in trade, it was rare for a wanderer like Keyes to not be severely haggled if he entered the fair alone. Therefore, they would usually find a circular base passing by and pay a price to temporarily join it, so that they could sell their goods at a more fair price when trading with other races. After listening to Keyes' question, Koss obviously treated him as a wandering captain who was begging to be carried. He patted his chest and said, "Captain, don't worry. The elders of our base have already found out that there are many twin-humped camel nobles who have come from the oasis in the market. This year, the base had harvested a lot of pearls from the clam harvesting area, so they had to stay there for at least a week. If you want to join our caravan temporarily, Koss is willing to introduce you." As a form of gratitude to the little navigator, on the way to the circular base, the young blue dragon, who was quite well versed in the ways of the world, deliberately caught a swordfish. He cut off the flat head of the swordfish and polished it into a shape. Then, he found a small piece of wood to make a grip and made a short sword that was more than 3 feet long and gave it to Koss. As for the remaining swordfish, Keyes sprinkled the spices he had brought from the ash world and made them into fish slices to share with the boy. The sky in the west turned from red to light gray, and then from gray to black. After sailing for about a night with the help of the stars in the sky, Keyes' teak boat arrived near the circular base of the people on the floating raft. With Koss as the introducer, they quickly followed a fishing boat into the gate of the circular base. The young blue dragon in human form stood at the bow of the boat, looking at the city that was pieced together with all kinds of wood and other building materials. Rather than calling it a city, The name village was actually more suitable for the settlement of the people on the floating raft. Like most of the existing human homes in the island world, this huge floating object that moved with the ocean current was buoyed by a buoy made of logs and fish skin airbags. The base was surrounded by a wall made of all kinds of wood. According to Koss, the wall was built by skilled craftsmen bit by bit, without using a single nail. And after the construction was completed, it was reinforced with fish glue made from boiling fish bladders, so the final wall could resist the attack of strong winds and sea monsters. It was very solid. The wall surrounded the settlement in a circular shape, and the entire settlement was built along the wall for people to live in or for other purposes. That was how the circular base got its name. After entering the circular base, a special pilot directed Keyes to anchor the boat to the dock in the heart of the base. Keyes found that the other boats were about the same size as his boat, and there were no bigger boats. There is a shark net under the base, and boats with a deeper draft can only dock at the special dock outside the wall. After hearing Keyes' question, Koss did not doubt him and explained in detail. Generally, those boats are used to hunt whales or to communicate with other circular bases, so the chance to dock at the dock is actually very rare. Suddenly, the sound of chanting and praying came to an abrupt halt. Koss clasped his hands in front of his chest and whispered the eulogy, turning the ancient into pulp, veins into vines, bodies into trees, blood into the sea. Ursula, who was too old, has passed away. Following the most basic ceremony, she will continue to bring us grace. The young blue dragon looked at the direction of the voice and saw many people gathered in what looked like a botanical garden. A few women were covering their faces and sobbing. They were holding some kind of funeral ceremony. The crowd gathered around a shaved corpse, and after reciting the eulogy, they poured the corpse into a large trough that was bubbling with yellow-green mud. Everyone who participated in the funeral grabbed a handful of soil from a small bag and followed the people in front of them to sprinkle the soil into the bubbling mud. Due to the Megalosaurus's naturally sensitive sense of smell, Keyes could not help but frown when he smelled the smell. The people who participated in the funeral were no better than the young blue dragon. Soon after the ceremony, the crowd dispersed. Only 2 people with gauze on their faces were left. They held long bamboo poles and kept stirring the mud in the trough. Granny Ursula is a legend in the circular base, Klaus said. The word legend made Klaus's face turn cold, but he quickly concealed his emotions. Klaus continued. Since she was very young, she devoted herself to sailing and exploring the ruins of the ancient human civilization. In the process of exploring the subterranean sea, she brought back many ancient plants from the ruins of the seabed and some unknown islands and built the base botanical garden. Some of the plant seeds in the garden were brought home to grow fruits. After eating, the fruits could make the people in the base healthier and live longer. It turned out that Keyes happened to be watching the funeral of a legend of the island world from afar. The gray-green mud looked disgusting and smelled even worse, but it could quickly turn the corpse into soil. This kind of making the best use of people style of funeral was a tradition developed by the people on the floating raft due to the lack of resources. Chapter 2:10. Steel coins and soil. These 2 important resources were the common equivalents in the circular base. Steel coins could be used to make various weapons and tools. Soil could be used to grow plants, providing nutrients for the people on the floating raft that could not be found in the fish. With Koss as his guide, Keyes quickly found the commercial hall of the circular base. In order to disguise himself as a wandering captain, he had to purchase some supplies and go through the procedures to temporarily join the base. The Zhan Yuan, the young blue dragon, gave a name that he came up with on the spot. He continued, "My name is Keyes. I would like to apply to join the circular base temporarily and participate in the transaction that will take place soon." The registrar took out a small wooden badge and pulled the handle of a machine beside him. The grindstone in the machine immediately spun rapidly and erased the engraved words on the badge in a few seconds. After re-engraving Keyes' information on the badge, the registrar handed the new badge over. Don't get into trouble when you're living in the circular base. Otherwise, you may be killed by the guards. In addition, you need to pay 10 steel coins in advance. After the transaction is completed, you'll have to pay 1/10 of the payment to the base. Of course, Keyes did not have any steel coins, but a Medici copper debon with the engraving erased could be used as a substitute. After going through the relevant procedures, Koss led him to a counter and took him to purchase supplies. The counter was not big, but there was a dazzling array of goods on it. There was not a lack of variety. Sea salt, various kinds of salted seafood, distilled fresh water, hemp ropes used on ships, sails made of palm fiber, lumps of wood used to repair ships, lumps of fish gelatin that could be used after being reheated among them. The most expensive goods were some plants planted in wooden pots, some of which had already borne fruit. From the shape of the branches, leaves, and fruits, Keyes could tell that most of these plants were probably lemons. These are the plants that Granny Ursula brought back, Koss enthusiastically introduced to the young blue dragon. At the same time, he persuaded, I have a small pot of lemon trees at home, but the fruits are not as good as the ones here. When you leave, I can give you a few branches and leaves, but the survival rate of the whole plant is not as high as the one sold here. The high-pitched sound of the conch horn broke the stillness of the morning, followed by the tight beat of the whale skin drum, and the clatter of footsteps in response to it. There's a fleet of ships heading towards the circular base. Koss pulled out the fishbone dagger that Keyes gave him and quickly explained to the young blue dragon. The guards have already climbed up the wall to stand guard. If it's the Black Flag walrus people, they'll blow the conch again. The Black Flag, mentioned by the boy, was referring to the fallen walrus people who obeyed the Council of Seven Gills of the demonic fish. Unlike their companions who lived on Thick Sturdy Island and formed the Federation with the polar bear people, these walrus people lived in the ocean all year round, making a name for themselves by raiding various circular bases or harassing the coastlines of the Empire and the Federation. Before the nervous boy could finish his words, the conch horn was blown again by the sentinel on the observation deck. The beat of the whaleskin drum also changed. 3 long beats, 1 short beat, 2 short beats, 1 long beat. Hearing the drum, the salesperson behind the counter and the registrar who had just finished the formalities for Keyes could no longer remain calm. After apologizing to the only remaining guest in the hall, Keyes, and asking him to leave, they immediately locked the door of the hall, picked up their weapons, and followed the guards up the wall. This is troublesome. Koss was a little nervous, and his originally rapid speech became a little stuttering. It's not just the Black Flag, but also the Broken Fangs, that vicious clan. They won't accept bribes, pay, or take captives. Once the base is breached, they'll start a massacre. The large warships in the base are still sailing far away to hunt whales. They won't be able to make it back in time. According to the rules of the floating raft people, Keyes, who had already completed the procedures to temporarily join the circular base, had the responsibility to participate in the defense work in such a critical situation. Thus, Keyes climbed up the wall of the base under Koss's lead. The guard captain of the base obviously knew Koss, and seeing that he was young, he assigned him a good job to climb up the observation tower and cooperate with the sentinels to report the latest movements of the walrus people's fleet to the guards. As for the young blue dragon in human form, although his face looked young, he was wearing a shark lizard armor, and his figure was much taller than the others. In addition to his status as a ship captain who had just temporarily joined the circular base, the guard captain gave him a shield covered in fish skin and a sharpened bamboo spear without hesitation, and sent him to the edge of the wall to defend against any walrus people warriors who might rush up. Keyes did not have any objections to this arrangement. In fact, he was even a little happy to have the opportunity to observe the war in the island world up close. After all, it would help him understand this plane more deeply. Unlike the other floating raft people who were trembling in fear before the battle, Keyes did not cover his head with a leather shield. Instead, he stood boldly on the wall and looked at the walrus people's fleet of the Broken Tooth clan that was sailing towards the circular base. Under his gaze, the walrus people's fleet quickly streaked across the open sea surface and kept approaching. Those ships were made of roughly smelted dark-colored metal and blackened wood. There were masts on the ships, but there were no sails at the moment. Only rows of oars extended from the sides of the ships, and they paddled with all their might amidst the increasingly loud sounds of the horns. Thanks to the extremely sharp eyesight of the Megalosaurus race, Keyes could clearly see what the so-called Black Flag, or rather, the fallen walrus people, looked like. They were generally fat and muscular, and their waist seemed to be only a little smaller than their height. Each of them was like an oak barrel filled with wine, and the kind that was especially huge. A small number of the walrus people, especially the ones with the most exaggerated physiques and looked like they belonged to the elite class, would wear armor made of clam shells strung together by seaweed vines. The rest of the walrus people were mostly bare-chested and only had an apron made of seaweed to protect their private parts. Almost all of the fallen walrus people had some barnacles and corals growing on their bodies. Although it would be a little scary to those with trypophobia, these appendages should be able to provide them with some protection during battle. The attentive young blue dragon also noticed that the tusks on the upper jaws of this group of walrus people were broken, which was also the reason why they were called the Broken-Tooth clan. The long tusks were sharpened into blades and tied to the ends of long wooden poles, making it into a pair of forks that each person held. Catapults, fire! After estimating that the walrus people's fleet had entered the firing range, the guard captain immediately ordered the catapults on the city wall to start working. Fire the algae oil bombs. Don't let the walrus people get close to the wall. Driven by manpower, the long arms of the catapults began to rotate. Stones soaked in the oil extracted from some kind of seaweed were first ignited, and then launched by centrifugal force. Most of the stones fell into the waves of the open sea, but there were still a few that hit the ships of the Broken-Tooth clan. After being hit by such a stone cannon, even the fat walrus man would be badly injured even if he didn't die. The most terrifying thing was that the algae oil on the stones would stick to the ship and burn. This was also the reason why the walrus people would usually lower their sails before an attack and only rely on paddles to propel the ships. Chapter 211. The walrus people of the island world had always been known for their savagery. Taking a beating without fighting back was naturally not their style. Not long after the ring-shaped base bombarded their fleet with burning stone cannons, the Broken-Tooth clan launched a retaliatory counterattack. Whoosh! 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 The giant crossbows on the fallen walrus people's warships began to unleash their power. The coral crossbows, which had been polished with barbs and blades, began to rain down on the ring-shaped base's walls. The leather shields that the floating raft people provided to the guards were naturally unable to withstand the barrage of crossbow bolts. Often, a single crossbow bolt would take away the lives of many people at the same time. Even if the crossbow bolts missed the wall, a small section of the wooden wall would directly collapse. Many of the guards were brought into the open sea by the collapsed wall and never floated up again. Not only that, some of the special crossbow bolts also had several strands of tough ropes woven from seaweed behind them. Once they hooked onto something that could be fixed, the walrus people on the ships would pull with all their might, allowing their ships to approach the base's walls faster. Archers, get ready! The captain of the guards ran to instruct the civilians to use fish glue and wood to repair the walls as he gave orders with all his might. First, look for elite walrus people. Fire at will. In Keyes' opinion, the weapons used by the floating raft people of the island world were not without merit in terms of shape. They were similar to the bows he had seen in his previous life. They were mainly made of bamboo and were about 6 feet long. They used an eccentric shooting method to obtain maximum tension and shot out long arrows made of whale bones or sea beast teeth as the arrowhead. However, although the power of the arrows from these longbows was not bad, and they had no problem piercing through the armor made of clam shells on the elite walrus people, their shooting speed was very low. Moreover, there were not many archers in the first place, so they were unable to effectively stop the enemy. Especially after some damage, the elite walrus people would either raise a thick shield made of giant clamshells or simply hide behind some ordinary walrus people to avoid the arrows. After shooting for a while, there were actually very few casualties. The captain of the guards also discovered this problem, so he immediately changed his strategy. He ordered the archers to quickly withdraw and replace them with more shield-wielding guards to resist the first wave of walrus people that was about to arrive. The windmills in the circular base were all activated. A large amount of seawater was pumped to the wall and then fired out by the water cannons to wash away the approaching Broken Tooth Clan ships. Clang! The first walrus ship slammed into the circular base. The ram at the front of the ship dug deep into the wall and couldn't be pushed away at all. Racket stick, put down a racket stick. This time, without waiting for the guard captain to give the order, several experienced veterans who had experienced the crisis of the Black Flag Walrus made the same decision. The battering poles that were set up inside the wall were suddenly released from one end of the net that was wrapped in a large number of stones. The other end of the battering poles, which was tied with a large number of sharpened wooden thorns, quickly flipped out of the wall and hit the walrus ships that were approaching. Every pole was soaked in blood when it was raised. The walrus men of the Broken Tooth Clan, who had gathered at the bow of their ships and were preparing to climb the circular base wall, were hit squarely and suffered heavy casualties in an instant. The people on the floating raft who were guarding the wall were greatly encouraged. For a moment, all kinds of cheers rose and fell. However, the veterans who had just put down the racket stick were now holding the weapons in their hands tightly. They didn't dare to be careless. The veterans knew that among the ancient giant tooth clansmen like the walrus men, there was no lack of shamans who were good at communicating with the elements. In fact, the Broken Tooth Clan didn't disappoint them. They were ancient enough that the shamans of the Broken Tooth Clan were proficient in an elemental spell that many other young clans didn't pass down. Seal of Ice. A dazzling rune appeared on the wall of the circular base. As long as one was within the range of this magic seal, any creature would instantly feel the weather that was colder than the winter of thick, sturdy island. Stiff, incomparably stiff. Whether it was the defending troops or the defensive weapons they controlled, they're all affected. The bone-chilling cold reduced the mobility of the people on the floating raft. Even simple movements like raising their hands and stomping their feet became extremely slow. The walrus men's situation was very different. Due to their thick layer of subcutaneous fat, the walrus men's situation was very different. The Seal of Ice didn't make any walrus men feel uncomfortable. An elite warrior of the Broken Tooth Clan roared and rolled forward on the deck of the ship. This was a traditional martial art of his clan. Using the advantage of the body, he rolled forward at high speed, accumulating his strength layer by layer and suddenly releasing it at the last moment. Divine Walrus Fist. The huge gauntlet made from a whole piece of ferromanganese or was imprinted on the wall of the circular base. The defenders who were troubled by the frost-sealing magic seal had no time to react. With a muffled bang, a hole the size of a person was smashed into the wall. The walrus warrior, who had caused all of this, only shook its dizzy head. Laughing loudly, it charged in through the hole and began a massacre at the base of the wall. However, this was just the beginning. Many elite walrus men followed the example of the first one who rushed into the circular base. While the Seal of Ice released by the shamans was still in effect, they rolled to the wall and used the Divine Walrus Fist to smoothly enter the circular base. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The holes created by the elite walrus men connected together, causing a small section of the wall to lose its foundation and collapse on a large scale. Keys, who was standing on this section of the wall, nimbly used the bamboo spear in his hand to jump to a safe place nearby. The other defending troops weren't so lucky. They all fell onto the walrus men's ships and were first killed by the cruel enemy. Then, they were strung up on the tusks to scare their own compatriots. Spearmen, withdraw the wall, hurry up. The captain of the guards had completely become the captain of the firefighters. He led a few good fighters to surround and kill the elite walrus men who rushed into the circular base. Get into formation and block the hole. In a hurry, the captain of the guard's moves became more and more sinister. He took advantage of the walrus men's fat body and short arms to circle behind them. He used a bronze spear to specifically attack the walrus men's lower body. As long as the walrus men's Achilles tendons or ankles were injured and they couldn't support themselves and fell to the ground, everyone would rush forward and stab them to death. After the elite walrus men opened up a path, many ordinary members of the Broken Tooth clan rushed in, but they were all killed by the archers. The archers who had retreated from the wall earlier now occupied the commanding heights and poured down arrows as much as they could. The walrus men of the Broken Tooth clan and the floating raft men of the circular base were in a stalemate. Chapter 2:12. The Broken Tooth clan was the first to choose to retreat. After fighting for about an hourglass, the walrus clan's fleet let out a muffled sound of drums. That's a human skin drum. It's smaller than a whale skin drum, and the tone of the drum is also deeper. A veteran beside Quest leaned on his weapon, treating the young blue dragon as a fledgling recruit. He tried to coax and scare him. Those walrus shamans can beat the human skin drum and cast black witchcraft to detain the souls of those who died in battle. Quest chuckled and did not respond to his words. The floating raft defenders relaxed after the end of the battle. The soldiers who were fighting with all their might collapsed on the spot. Some of them were injured, while others were simply exhausted. Someone brought them oily soup made from whale stew. There were also specialized healers who brought herbs and tools to help the wounded. At the last moment of the battle, a walrus man who had fallen to the ground sat on the bronze spear and injured the captain's wrist. However, this rather self-disciplined man had been enduring the pain. He only fastened his injured hand with a belt and let the doctors take care of the injured young men under him. In this battle, the defenders of the circular base had used up a lot of their weapons. The archers had almost no arrows left. Some people sailed out of the sluice gate in small boats. Some went to pick up the floating wood, and some went to dismember the walrus ships that were still nailed to the wall. The Black Flag walruses were usually very cruel, and the Broken Tooth clan was especially bloodthirsty. Therefore, there were not many injured people on the floating raft. Most of the injured people were attacked first and died tragically in the battle. Other than the defenders who could no longer fight, and children like us who did not help much in the battle, the old and the weak in the circular base were all mobilized to rebuild the base after the battle. Everyone had a complicated expression on their faces. There was the joy of surviving, mixed with the grief of seeing someone close to them die. Key saw Kas sobbing softly as he lifted a piece of collapsed wood. The young blue dragon stepped forward and helped him lift the heavy piece of wood. "Oh, thank you, Captain." Curtis felt his shoulders lighten. He turned around and saw that it was Quest who was helping him. He sniffled and quickly held back his tears as he thanked him. "I can do it myself. It's just that when I thought of my parents who died like this, I feel a little sad. No matter how many times they had experienced it, fighting was not easy. Just imagine. They wore coarse armor sewn from fish skin and swung their weapons until they could no longer feel their shoulders. They were worried about accidentally injuring themselves and their companions, but they were even more worried that a sharp blade would stab them. When the battle was over, they dragged their exhausted bodies and collapsed on the ground. All they could think about was who was still alive and who did not return. In this ring-shaped base with no ground under their feet and no roof above their heads, the people on the floating raft could only rely on the strength of small groups to survive. While accepting the gifts of the sea, they had to endure the violence of the sea. Last time, this time, and the next time. The Broken Tooth clan's next attack came much earlier than expected. Just as the people in the circular base relaxed, they launched a swift and violent attack from below sea level. Unsurprisingly, the first to discover the abnormality was Keys, who had the keen perception of a megalosaurus. When the walrus people moved underwater at high speed, the faint sound of water turbulence quickly reached the young blue dragon's ears. It turned out that the battle, just now, was just a feint. The purpose was to exhaust the floating raft people's physical strength and energy. As an amphibious race, the walrus people were more adapted to living and fighting in the sea than humans. First, they jumped into the water from the retreating ships and returned at an astonishing speed. Then, they took out mussels and oysters, which had been sharpened to a rather sharp edge, and slowly and patiently cut up the shark net below the circular base. Finally, they jumped out of the water from the dock in the heart of the base and violently pounced on their opponents. Kill those water monkeys and take over their base. In the eyes of the walrus people, the floating raft people could no longer be considered survivors of the ancient human empire. Thus, they were scorned as water monkeys. Plundering the water monkeys' base would not only allow them to claim credit from their demonic fish masters, but also allow them to obtain more supplies. It was naturally difficult for them to give up on this kind of business that didn't require any capital but had double the benefits. Not only that, but the sentries on duty on the watchtower also discovered that the retreating Broken Tooth Clan battleships actually raised their sails and paddled their oars, returning to the circular base at an even faster speed than before. Prepare the defensive facilities. Everyone move out quick. Pulling off the belt that held his injured wrist, the guard captain quickly gave his orders. Use fishing nets to trap the walrus people that have landed. Don't let them wander around the base as they please. Although his judgment was accurate, there were just too many walrus people that had come ashore from below the water. Even if the circular base turned out in full force, ordinary people would suddenly become timid in the face of the ferocious alien race. Damn it. The veteran who had just mocked Keys wanted to assassinate an elite walrus person that was trapped in the net, but who would have thought that the fisherman who fixed the fishing net would make a mistake and expose a flaw in the net, allowing the walrus to escape. Aim for their ankles. Those guys won't be able to dodge easily with their short legs. He was reminding Keys, the new recruit, but how could the young blue dragon, who had been on the battlefield for a long time, not know the point of attacking the enemy's weakness? The spear was originally aimed at the walrus person's big foot, but when the walrus person bent down to block with the toothed fork, the spear suddenly changed direction and easily pierced through the thick layer of subcutaneous fat and into the enemy's throat. Twisting his wrist to retract the spear, the walrus person fell to the ground. Blood gushed out from the gaps between his palms that were covering his neck. Seeing this scene, the veteran who was just reminding Quest of his combat skills also swallowed his saliva and gulped. On the other hand, the young blue dragon seemed to have done something very ordinary. He even had the time to squat beside the walrus person with broken teeth, using his hands to lift the fat body to estimate the weight of this creature. Help! Be careful behind you. A familiar cry for help came from the side, accompanied by the crackling sound of wood breaking. Keys looked over and saw that it was the boy Koss who was shouting. Behind him was a rolling meatball that crushed and broke the obstacles in its way. Holding the spear in his hand, the young blue dragon bent his waist and bent his arm, using the spear as a javelin and throwing it out horizontally. It was so fast that it could tear through the air, bringing great kinetic energy to the weapon. It very smoothly penetrated the walrus person's body that was constantly spinning. Although the bamboo spear was broken in the end due to the poor quality of the material, this actually happened inside the walrus person's body. The bamboo spikes that shot out from his body caused him unbearable pain. In just 2 moves, he had killed 2 elite walrus men of the Broken Tooth Clan without any hesitation. Keys's amazing battle record attracted the attention of more opponents, and at the same time, many enemies launched attacks on him. Chapter 213. His heart was cold, his blood was cold, and so was the spear in his hand. He was frozen. After facing the spell of the Broken Tooth Clan's elemental shaman, the few people on the floating raft had witnessed the literal meaning of this joke. Since the battle was taking place inside the circular base, everyone was very restrained. They did not use fire to burn the walrus people. Coupled with the fact that the defenders had just experienced a great battle and were all exhausted, the civilians had become the main force of the resistance. But now, they had a face 6 feet tall and nearly 6 feet in circumference. Furthermore, these ferocious and powerful alien warriors had to face them. It was easy to imagine how weak these ordinary raftsmen, who had only received some basic combat training, would be. Of course, there were exceptions to everything. In the area where the young blue dragon stood guard, No matter how strong the walrus people were, they could only be defeated on the spot. There was no exception. "Hey, good boy." The veteran who had T's keys before also changed the way he addressed him. At the same time, he tried his best to get close to him and cleverly stayed close to him to fight. "If I'm not dead after this battle, I'll definitely treat you to the sweet wine my wife brewed with sugarcane." 3 big cups. Key still did not reply, but turned around and gave him a push. The ice shard spell that the walrus shaman had thrown at him exploded where he was standing. "Enough sweet wine, all free of charge." Realizing that he had just dodged a bullet, the veteran who had just recovered from the shock immediately shouted out his gratitude. Koss, who had been deliberately brought along by Keys to help him with the swordfish dagger, pointed at a few walrus people who were walking towards them and said in a trembling voice, "Captain, the walrus people are flying a kite. Their leader is here." The walrus kite that the boy mentioned was not the tactic of running and fighting at the same time, but an ancient custom of the walrus people. Whenever the leader of their clan appeared on the battlefield, they would release a kind of gorgeous kite. This kind of kite was usually made of whale bones, and the surface of the kite was engraved with the totem of the walrus clan. Therefore, the kite of the Broken Tooth clan was marked with a broken walrus tusk, and the ink around the broken tusk was dyed black. Below the kite in the sky, 3 walrus people who had just jumped out of the water stood side by side. The leader of the Broken Tooth clan, Dialogue Broken Tooth, and 2 elemental shamans who accompanied him were closely staring at the young blue dragon who was on a killing spree. "Human," Durak, who was much larger than the average walrus man, said in a low voice. With his appearance, many walrus men also surrounded Keys. "Do you dare to fight me fairly?" As he spoke, he threw the fork in his hand to an elemental shaman behind him. 2 huge fists collided, making a dull sound. After witnessing Keys's bravery, the walrus leader immediately decided to use practical actions to prove to his people that he was a qualified leader. And the method was very simple. That is, according to their tradition, to kill the enemy of the clan with bare hands. The people on the floating raft who were struggling to resist the second invasion of the Broken Tooth clan also noticed the abnormality here. Under the command of the captain of the guards, many soldiers and armed civilians surrounded the enemy leader. "I agree to your challenge." Looking at the sudden confrontation between the human and the walrus people, Keys realized that this was a good opportunity to increase his reputation in the island world. So he replied loudly, "One-on-one, I won't use weapons." Hearing that a water monkey dared to boast so shamelessly, many of the surrounding walrus people hissed in disdain. Before the young blue dragon could react, D-Rock actually punched one of the people behind him. The insult to his opponent would also affect his reputation to some extent. The honor of the leader of the Broken Tooth clan could not be tarnished by anyone. For a moment, the surrounding walrus people were all silent. D-Rock clenched his fists, stretched his muscles and bones, and strode towards his opponent. As an expert wrestler, even if the opponent seemed to be skilled, he was confident that he could suppress him in a short period of time with his weight advantage. It was worth mentioning that the walrus leader not only had a good physique, but his movements were also quite cunning. He always deliberately kept one shoulder facing Keys and never exposed his entire upper body to the opponent. When the distance between the two was less than 10 steps, D-Rock suddenly roared and took the initiative to launch a shoulder attack. This was his specialty. Who knows how many challengers have been defeated by his enormous strength? Because he had to disguise himself as an ordinary human, the young blue dragon did not choose to face it head-on, but quickly dodged to the side behind the walrus leader. The giant who was in the middle of the collision revealed a sinister smile, twisted his waist and extended his arm, and was about to smash Keys's head with his arm. If this hit landed, not to mention a human, even a hard reef would be smashed to pieces in an instant. But Keys's speed was still faster. He quickly crouched down to avoid Durock's fist and grabbed the walrus man's ankle with both hands and suddenly hooked it behind him. Under the inertia of his upper body, the fat walrus man directly rolled and fell. But in the end, D-Rock was still an experienced opponent. After smashing a large area of the circular base's wooden floor, He promptly used his tough and bulging belly to cushion the fall, and the thick subcutaneous fat to protect him from any additional damage. The broken tooth leader's tongue stuck out of his lips, licking the teeth that he had broken, and crouched down to vent his anger by smashing the ground with both hands. In the midst of the splintered wooden floor, he lowered his body and once again rushed towards his opponent with a move similar to a sumo wrestler. Keyes understood that this idiot wanted to make full use of his weight advantage, so he instinctively used the defensive moves of the Twilight Sect that he had learned from the Nine-Sword catalog. Although some of the Twilight Sect's throwing techniques couldn't be used because his feet weren't on the ground, as a humanoid megalosaurus, Keyes had brute strength that even the top Twilight Sect warriors couldn't reach. Moreover, just because throwing techniques couldn't be used didn't mean that the Twilight Sect's techniques couldn't be used. Using the empty-handed blade block technique, the young blue dragon not only dodged Diroc's shove, but also caught his wrist in his own palm. Gotcha! With a crisp sound, Keyes used the walrus man's arm as an axis and forcefully pressed down in a clockwise direction. Diroc's weight and the huge inertia brought about by his own mass once again crushed him, and one of the walrus man's arms appeared unnaturally twisted. With a successful strike, Diroc knelt on the ground with a plop. Seeing this, the other members of the Broken Tooth clan immediately wanted to rush over to save their leader. "Don't move!" Keyes lifted his leg and rode on the back of the walrus man who had fallen to the ground. He wrapped one of his hands around his neck and quickly tightened his grip in a cross-shaped position. The suffocation made Diroc's eyes pop out, and his hands powerlessly slapped the ground. Retreat? Or simply change leaders? The young blue dragon playfully asked the group of walrus men. Since the two female walrus elemental shamans who came with Diroc were his spouses, the answer given by the Broken Tooth clan's walrus man was naturally clear. The open sea finally regained its calm. Chapter 214. The veteran kept his promise and invited Keyes to drink the sweet wine made by his wife from sugarcane. After using the life of the leader of the Broken Tooth clan to force the walrus people to retreat, the young blue dragon became the hero of the people on the floating raft. In the days that followed, he had to openly and secretly refuse the flirtatious looks of many young girls and young women in the circular base, and even recommend themselves to sleep with him. It was only when the watchtower of the circular base had observed the coastline of the Camel Empire and found the trade cape that extended out of the land that the women who came to ask for children voluntarily or at the behest of the elders stopped bothering him because they had to organize the goods in the base. Alas, the price of fame. Keyes squatted on the top of the mast of the Zhanyuan, sipping the juice of a coconut. He secretly laughed at the experience of the past few days while thinking about how he should contact the camel people he was about to meet. I have to first see what resources the camel people have, and then examine what they lack and what they need. I just hope they won't be like the people on the floating raft, who have no valuable resources other than manpower. Like the people on the floating raft in the circular base, Keyes also made some preparations for the upcoming market trade. He specially prepared some goods and wanted to try to trade with the camel people. Among them were some products from the ocean of the island world. For example, ornaments carved from the skull of the hard-headed trout, which had a texture similar to ivory. Leather armor made from the skin of the swordfish and sailfish caught before they came to the circular base after being dried and tanned. There were also some product from the ash world. For example, there were a few pieces of pink cube lake salt crystals and some sedge stalks that had been repeatedly washed for several days. They were then arranged and pressed to make sedge paper that could be used for writing. In order to prevent them from being stranded, the circular base did not directly approach the shore. Instead, they chose a suitable anchorage location and used cranes to lift several huge polished stone anchors before sinking them to the bottom of the sea. The camel lookout post on a cliff on the coast saw the flag raised in the circular base, indicating the purpose of participating in the market trade, and sent a few canoes to receive them. The young blue dragon was also able to observe the camel people up close for the first time. Those who came in the canoe were all single-humped camel people. They belonged to the subordinate class of the two classes of the Camel People Empire. Above them were the double-humped camel people, who were equivalent to aristocrats. All of them were tall and sturdy. Their heads were like camels, and there were humps on their backs. Although he was used to slightly hunching his upper body when standing, he was still taller than the walrus man Keys had seen before by more than 2 feet. According to Koss, who was familiar with the young blue dragon, the twin-humped camel people were even taller and stronger than the single-humped camel people. They were also much more intelligent and knowledgeable. Therefore, the twin-humped nobles had many priests or priests who could serve the camel god and were proficient in divine arts. Welcome to the border of the empire. Facing the elders in the circular base, the hunchback leading the reception team nodded slightly. Although his words were polite, there was always a sense of alienation. Survivors of the ancient allies, you are about to set foot on the sacred land of the empire. Please cherish the friendship of the great empire. Traders who land are not allowed to carry any weapons, not allowed to relieve themselves in unauthorized places, not allowed to maliciously raise prices, and not allowed to insult the great empire verbally or physically. Once discovered, no tolerance is allowed. As the captain of the single-humped camel people spoke, he inadvertently spat into the air. However, the elders in front of him who were listening with their heads raised did not spit. Those strict prohibitions were like syrup to them. After the baptism of the single-humped camel people spit, the leading elder of the circular base took out a fish-skin bag and took out many pearls with a diameter of half a finger. He respectfully presented the gifts prepared by the people on the floating raft to the camel people who had come from afar. We will cherish this friendship. I'll have to trouble Captain Geller to strictly control my people who are about to land and take care of them. The elder who passed by this place every year obviously knew this old acquaintance, so he tried to curry favor with him. After accepting the gifts from the elder of the circular base, the attitude of the single-humped camel people's leader, Geller, obviously improved. Following that, not only did he quickly complete a series of inspections of the goods, but he even kindly reminded the people who were about to land for trading. The circular base that we came to previously has already traded a large amount of sea salt. It's best you change to other goods, or be careful that you won't be able to sell them for a good price. The crinoline and seaweed taste pretty good. A noble will be coming to purchase them in bulk in the next 2 days. There's a batch of good materials at the timber exchange, but the price is increased by 25%. You can mark the price when you buy them. Just say that you are Geller's old friend, and that the merchant will give you a special discount. The boss of the gift of the Earth Chamber of Commerce has recently become obsessed with collecting colorful corals. If you have any, bring more. You can directly exchange for humus soil from him. It's much more cost-effective than buying it with steel coins. The ancients weren't lying when they said that one shouldn't be blinded by gifts. After completing the tedious preparations for landing, the single-humped camel people Geller took the lead and stepped onto his canoe to lead the way. The Zhang Yuan and the other sailboats loaded with goods followed closely behind. Even though the raft people's boats were much faster than the camel people's canoes due to their shipbuilding skills, they still lowered half of their sails and obediently followed behind. Under the lead of the treasurer elder who followed the caravan to land, the raft people who sailed out of the circular base drove their small boats while singing a song of praise called Camel People's Empire Friendship. The song penetrated the layers of waves and reached the ears of the camel leader who was at the front of the group. This tall camel man listened to the raft people's praise of the empire and stood up in the small boat, waving the halberd in his hand to liven up the atmosphere. This action frightened the single-humped camel people who were steering the boats. Although they stayed on the canoe made of giant wood, they were all landlubbers. They were afraid that they would capsize and fall into the water if a wave came crashing over. We only need land and grassland. Let the sea sleep on its bed, and I sleep on my bed. The single-humped camel people who were rowing with all their might and wanted to get ashore faster muttered. They recited the teachings that the priest of the camel god had once taught them, while they resented the captain who dared to jump on the canoe. Finally, when they entered the solid arms of the headland, the camels who were rowing on the edge of the dock breathed a sigh of relief. They quickly got up and jumped onto the dock, using their thick toes to greedily feel the stable ground and relieve their tension. For the raft people's boats, the dock did not provide enough parking space. Therefore, most captains of single-boat boats like the one that Keyes was driving simply drove their boats onto the beach. Following the example of the others, the young blue dragon dug a hole above the beach and buried the large wooden nail that was tied to the rope deep into the hole. Then, he lifted a few reefs to hold it in place. After making this simple anchor that was used to prevent the boat from being taken away by the sea during high tide, Keyes stepped onto the beach and looked at the unfamiliar land. Chapter 2:15. The trading market was not on the beach. After the people on the raft went ashore, they still had to ride on the carts pulled by the cleft hoof bulls and travel inland for about half an hourglass. The journey was not bumpy, but it was not easy. Clack, clack, clack. The cleft hoof bulls stepped on the road, paved with gravel made of mortar, making rhythmic tapping sounds. Unlike the hunchback guides who sat on the ox carts, most of the people on the raft followed beside the carts and helped to turn the wheels. They used the empty space to store the goods they brought ashore from the circular base. Every ox cart was full for fear of leaving something behind. After all, they had crossed the ocean to come here, and there was only one chance to land and trade with the hunchbacks every year. There was a clear distinction between the wide beach and the desert around the hunchback empire. Keyes was a little surprised that this dividing line was similar to the pillar of skulls he had seen on the first level of Bator, Avernus. A continuous low wall spread out, and the material of this low wall was the bones of some monsters. Geller, who sat at the front of the caravan, was the first to jump off the cart and pull open a piece of deer firewood that was pieced together with the hard shells of armored monsters. It's really not durable material. The single-humped hunchback captain pulled hard just now, and the deer firewood, which had become a little brittle due to long-term exposure to the sun, broke into a few pieces. He joked to the people on the raft. Next time, we can bring some of those monsters to do business. It's really not durable. The treasurer elder and Captain Geller, who were sent to lead the team from the circular base, smiled. But these hunchbacks who had lived on the land for a long time did not know what a terrible nightmare it would be if they encountered a group of armored monsters in the sea. When the mountains on the west side of the caravan looked dry and yellow in the afterglow of the setting sun, the caravan of people on the raft finally reached the end of the road that the hunchbacks had specially built to facilitate the transportation of goods. A small oasis appeared in the desert. The oasis was not large, but there were many buildings in it. It was mainly divided into 3 areas: the open-air market for trading, the wooden houses for the camel people, and the thatched huts for the people on the floating raft to live in. In addition, there were several wells in this oasis that the camel people called hut. However, they were only free to the camel people. If the people on the floating raft wanted to drink the water here, they had to pay a certain fee. Of course, they could also use goods to replace the price. There was a large pot set up outside the oasis. 2 camel men stood beside the pot, waiting for the caravan to arrive. Keyes found that the 2 hunchbacks were even more exaggerated than Captain Gelly. When he took a closer look, he saw that there were 2 humps on their backs. One of the 2 hunchbacks was still young, but he was as hard and sharp as obsidian. His name was Proud Twin Peaks, and he was a noble who came to this border market from the central oasis. And his teacher was standing beside him at this time. No one would have thought that the once famous Jursang Twin Peaks, a priest favored by the camel god, the first elemental shaman of the empire, and a powerful warlord, would patiently wait for a group of floating raft merchants here. Sir Gelly, the guide on the ox cart at the front of the caravan, noticed that the hoods of the 2 camel men were made of high-quality cloth with complicated embroidery patterns on the edges. He quickly jumped off the ox cart and ran over. When he saw the face of the old hunchback under the hood, the captain quickly knelt down and licked the other party's toes. He said, "If you have any orders, I won't dare to disobey." Jursang stretched out his arm that looked like a withered branch because of his old age, but it was still very strong. He pulled Captain Gelly up from the ground and said in a gentle tone, "You didn't ask me where I came from, very good. You didn't ask me why I came, very good. Now, stay quietly and wait for me to complete the traditional ceremony." After that, Jursang took out a handful of seasonings mixed with Yangsu grass, desert herbs, star anise, and other spices from the bag at his waist, and threw it into the boiling pot beside him. It didn't take long for a rich aroma to fill the air. The large piece of taboo mutton that bobbed up and down in the boiling water emitted a slight smell. The slightly egg-yellow grease dotted on the white and tender muscles, which was very beautiful. The treasurer elder among the people on the floating raft saw that Gelly respected the old camel man so much, so he naturally didn't dare to neglect him. He quickly took out some pickled whale meat, sea bass, and tuna meat from the caravan's goods, piled them in front of his chest, and ran to the big pot, and threw all these ingredients from the sea into it. Fish and sheep were the freshest. This was a ritual before the trade between the people on the raft and the camel people. Ingredients from the land and the sea were gathered in a pot to cook a delicious broth with a unique taste. It also symbolized the friendship between the two races that had gathered together. In the following days, the taboo mutton and fish in this big pot would be the common food of all the people on the floating raft and the camel people in the trading camp. Soup, firewood, and ingredients could be restocked, but if the flame was extinguished or if any party no longer put ingredients into the pot, then the trading market would immediately be terminated, and the people on the floating raft would have to leave immediately and withdraw from the land of the empire. The merchants in the circular base, with the help of the camel guards, unloaded the goods from the ox carts and transported them little by little to the open-air trading market in the oasis. Proud Twin Peaks asked doubtfully, "Master Jursang, why did you condescend to learn from these people on the floating raft? They, weak and Philistine, yes." Girsan lifted his hood and sniffed the aroma coming out of the cauldron. "But from a certain point of view, are we the same? No matter how you deny it, the camel empire is powerless against the dangers lurking in the depths of the sea. Although the camel god of my race has not yet reacted, the more ancient spirit of elements, which is more closely related to this world, has given me a foretelling that the opportunity to bring peace to the four seas is hidden among these people on the floating raft." Proud Twin Peaks couldn't comment on his teacher's words. Although he instinctively did not believe that the spirit of elements could be more omniscient than the great camel god, in the face of such a respected elder, he was not qualified to say the word caution. The young Twin Peaks camel could only bow his head respectfully, while his master turned his eyes to the back of the caravan of people on the floating raft at this time. "When the earth boils, the mighty will be revealed. The smoke and the waves will return with the wind." Jursang silently recited the prophecy he received a few days ago when he communicated with the spirit of elements and fell into deep thought for a long time. But he did not know that among the people on the floating raft who came to trade, there was a pair of eyes observing him. "Interesting," the young blue dragon muttered to himself. Chapter 2:16. Captain Koss, who was squatting next to the stall, had finished selling his collected and dried crinoline and some leather bags made of fish skin. At this time, he squatted next to Keys and said with some envy, "If this goes on, you will be able to collect all the wood needed to build a new ship in less than 2 days." He was right. The bone carvings brought by the young blue dragon were particularly popular. The hard-headed trout skull used to carve this kind of ornament looked and felt very similar to the protruding teeth of an ancient edge-toothed elephant that had gone extinct in the island world. It was an extremely expensive ornament material, and often only the hunchback nobles could afford it. At Keys' stall, this kind of small bone carvings could be exchanged for some ordinary wood that was abundant in the central oasis. Naturally, the hunchbacks were scrambling for it. Of course, the hard-headed trout skull was not the only hot commodity in the market. Unlike some of the older merchants, the young hunchback warriors preferred those steel coins that could be smelted into weapons and armor. It was just that the circular base also had a demand for materials such as steel, so the supply was not much. At most, each stall would have a few dozen in stock for sale. Proud Twin Peaks was also looking for enough steel coins. Like some other hunchbacks, he was also looking for these metal items produced by the disappeared human empire from stall to stall. He already had a halberd made of steel, which allowed him to repeatedly achieve good results in the tournament. However, The armor on his body was still the traditional hunchback armor, made of copper pieces strung together with leather rope. It was heavy and not easy to maintain. Therefore, the young Twin Peaks aristocrat wanted to collect enough steel coins to upgrade his armor. Truth be told, as a child of a noble family with 2 peaks, he could have obtained a rare resource, such as steel from the gifts of his elders. That was how he obtained the materials to forge the steel halberd from his Twin Peaks. However, he was already an adult last year. Accepting gifts was neither in line with the hunchback's tradition nor honorable. Moreover, his teacher, Gear-san, valued this very much. If he dared to disobey, the consequences would be that all the efforts he had put in to become Gearsan's disciple would be in vain. What is this? A question attracted the attention of Keys, who was observing proud Twin Peaks. Is it some kind of fresh food with a special flavor? Or is it a material that can be used to make some items? The hunchback who spoke was wearing a hooded robe. When he moved slightly, there would be a faint sound of metal rubbing against each other. He should be wearing a set of chainmail. He was much taller than a normal hunchback, almost as tall as Keys's ogre companions. One of his eyes was dark, as if he had been blinded by a sharp weapon or a claw. His right hand was leaning on a straight staff made of beech wood, and a copper-tipped hammer was hanging from his waist. Who else could it be but Gear-san? The item that the old hunchback was inquiring about was the papyrus that the stall had yet to sell. This made the young blue dragon quite curious. This is papyrus. It can be used for writing and painting, Key said as he picked up a piece of blackened charcoal. He wanted to write some words, but he remembered the poor literacy rate of the island world. The number of people who knew how to write was almost 0, so he decided to draw some images for demonstration instead. With patience and some skills, you can express the meaning you want to convey on the papyrus. You're drawing flowers, no windmills? The young blue dragon's drawing skills were comparable to his shooting skills. So after picking up his work, Gearson took a while to identify the abstract geometric figures on the papyrus. The famous Twin Peaks aristocrat in the Hunchback Empire was not annoyed. Instead, he rolled up the papyrus with great interest and weighed it with one hand. Then he pulled out a small piece of papyrus stem from the paper and tasted it in his mouth. How much does this paper cost? Oh, just tell me how much would you want to exchange? Gearsan thought that for the people on the floating raft, the cost was only equivalent to the time and energy needed to make and collect the raw materials. It was not easy to make an equivalent judgment, so he asked Keys to give him the amount of wood he wanted to exchange for a piece of papyrus as a reference. If I buy all your papyrus, can you give me a cheaper price? Or you don't need to give me the papyrus, but teach me the making method and raw material formula. How much wood do you need in exchange? Howran had to admit that the old hunchback's idea was very shrewd. Unfortunately, he still did not know that papyrus was not produced in the island world, nor did he know the difference between the CIF price and the FOB price. Quest didn't immediately answer his question. Instead, he thought for a while and asked a new question. I've already obtained enough lumber from this trade. What if I don't want to use the lumber to exchange, but directly take your gold coins? What do you think? After the catastrophe, the most valuable currency in the island world was the steel coins that were fished out from the seabed and made from the steel objects that were once produced in the human countries. Between the Polar Bear Federation and the Hunchback Empire, gold coins with a lower value were often used. Because there were a lot of high-quality gold mines on the 2 main continents, this metal, which was born with monetary properties, naturally became the preferred material for the universal currency. However, gold could not directly change the living situation of the people on the floating raft, so when they landed on the island, usually no one would choose to settle with gold coins. Yes, no problem. Gearson picked up a few bundles of papyrus from a stall and patiently checked whether there were any defects. Then he took out a few pieces of gold coins from the Hunchback Empire that were hammered into squares and engraved with Een runes and handed them to Keys. I'll give you a refund if you overpay. If papyrus could be exchanged for gold, the merchants of Medic would probably break their heads to come to the island world. Not to mention how high the profit was. Gold, a precious metal, was in circulation in the Ashes world. Most countries, including Medic in Japan, still used silver, which had a lower value, as their currency. There were a total of 3 bundles of papyrus on the stall, more than 150 pieces altogether. Keys took the hunchback gold from Girsan and cupped his hands. "Thank you for your business. That's all I'll charge you. You don't have to pay more." Both parties were satisfied with the transaction, and the old hunchback hurriedly left with the newly bought products. The young blue dragon also packed up the stall and took the gold coins to the trading house opened by the hunchback merchants. He wanted to test the real purchasing power of gold in the island world. Chapter 217. There are always interesting things in the sea that people can't imagine. I remember there was a small octopus in the tide pool on the seashore. If you yelled boo at them, those little things would immediately turn white. You see, it's this color. Girsan used his fingers to scoop out a small piece of white pigment from the color plate on the table. He rubbed it with his index finger and thumb while dipping it in some water and smearing it evenly. Then, he pressed the 2 fingers on the newly purchased papyrus and drew a white pattern. Magenta extracted from the body of the cochineal, bone spiral purple extracted from the shellfish, wax, frankincense, turpentine, and pine tar mixed with alkaline solution to wash lapis lazuli. One pigment after another was put into use. Half an hourglass passed, and under Girsan's careful depiction, a magnificent painting appeared on the papyrus. He fixed the painting on the wall with wooden nails to shorten the drying process. When it was completely dry, the old camel shaman began to recite the spell of summoning the elements, casting spells on every line and every piece of the rendered pattern. Standing on the side, proud Twin Peaks carefully watched his teacher's every operation step. Girsan was not a painting and calligraphy enthusiast. With so much effort, the picture he made was actually a prototype of an elemental summoning array. In the island world, the development of magic was still in a relatively primitive stage. According to the division of schools, most of the spellcasters on this plane mastered the spells of the school of incantation. Shamans, who could communicate and summon elemental forces, were the mainstream among them. Whether one was qualified to inherit the shaman's path depended on whether one could successfully communicate with the elemental spirits. Many apprentices worked hard all their lives to learn, but in the end, they could only summon a weak flame. It was not enough for cooking, let alone to use it to fight the enemy. In the process of constantly exploring experience, the shaman masters who had accumulated a lot of experience and lessons would prepare the elemental summoning array for their disciples to enlighten them and increase the possibility of success. They needed to cut open trees that had been growing for at least 100 years. First, they needed to make the core of the tree into a wooden board, and then apply paraffin evenly on it. Then, they used a short golden rod to carve a pattern little by little on the solidified paraffin. Then, they used pigments extracted from ores, plants, and creatures to polish and shape it. Finally, he had to chant an incantation to add a special spell to the elemental summoning array. The entire process had a strict time requirement. If it took too long, the elemental activity of the various raw materials would be greatly reduced, and the magic circle made would lose the ability to assist in communicating with the elemental spirits. In this way, the already tedious process became even more difficult. Even the most skillful shaman masters couldn't guarantee that the ritual array they created would work 100% of the time. "Teacher," taking the papyrus that Girsan handed to him, the young camel nobleman asked in surprise, "You want me to use this now, to complete the initiation ritual?" Girsan nodded. Although using papyrus as a carrier was much simpler than using traditional production techniques, maintaining concentration for nearly an hourglass still made the old hunchback feel a little tired. "Hurry up and give it a try. Follow the visualization method I taught you before and try to communicate with the elemental spirits." He only said half of the sentence, and there was no need to explain the rest to an apprentice. In fact, with Girsan's knowledge, he immediately discovered the great value of this product after seeing the papyrus. Drawing the elemental summoning array was just a preliminary attempt. If it could be used properly, in fact, not only the inheritance of shamanism, but also any other knowledge could be written down and popularized on a large scale with the help of this cheap carrier. Following his teacher's instructions, the proud Twin Peaks immediately began to visualize the elemental summoning development on the papyrus in his hand. The process was so smooth that it was beyond Gearson's expectation. As time went by, the fine sand at the bottom of the camel apprentice's feet slowly gathered together, gradually covering his broad and thick toes and gradually climbing up along his calves. Smoke rose from the place where his fingers touched the papyrus, and circles of charred marks appeared on the surface of the paper. However, the apprentice's fingers were not hurt at all. On the papyrus, the white pigment taken from some kind of octopus body fluid became wet again. The white lines connected the parts where the fingers touched, and there seemed to be an electric current passing through, making a crackling sound. Gearson's guess was verified. The papyrus did have a unique value, and the fact that it could be used as the carrier of the shaman's initiation ritual alone was enough to make the upper-class nobles of the Camel Empire scramble for it. Who the hell is that man on the raft? What is the connection between the papyrus, or that man, and the prophecy of the elemental spirits? Is it the right time to report these findings to the Twin Peaks Temple? With the success of the experiment, Gearson found that he now had a series of problems that needed to be solved urgently. Unlike the Twin Peaks Camel Man, our protagonist, the young Blue Dragon Keys, was very excited at this time. He took the camel gold coins exchanged with the papyrus to the camel merchants in the market, wanting to examine the purchasing power of gold in the Camel Empire of the island world. To his delight, this precious metal, which was highly valued in the Ash world, was even cheaper than he had expected. Take wood, for example. He spent 3 gold coins to buy wood from the camel merchants, and only 5 silver coins to buy wood of the same material, weight, and volume in Medici. If weight was considered, the purchasing power of camel gold coins was even less than that of silver coins. Even if interdimensional trade required a certain amount of upfront costs, the high profits generated by the price difference were enough to bear. Not to mention that in addition to the papyrus, Keys had many other options. For example, the fanatic armor that could be sold at a sky-high price in Nome, the floating behemoth that could be quantitatively produced. Once the commercial reach of the scales of eternal order extended to this plane, it was almost certain that he would get a huge amount of excess profits. However, as the saying goes, a cannon fired 10,000 taels of gold was also true in reverse. While seizing a lot of benefits, he would gradually face more and more competition. In the end, it was very likely that he would need to resort to force to solve the dispute. In addition to the demonic fish that he had already fought, the imaginary enemies that Keys needed to think of included the primitive gods of the island world. And the strongest among them was the camel god of the Camel Empire. To fight or to cooperate? For the young Blue Dragon, this was a difficult question to decide, but the real choice was not in his hands. Chapter 2:18. The Double Peak Temple itself was 2 independent stone cubes. The top was decorated with gold foil, the walls were coated with plaster, and they were connected by a tall colonnade. Every column in the colonnade was a whole fir, and they were all painted with colorful colors. This temple symbolized the unity of theocracy and royal power of the Camel Empire. In fact, every Camel Emperor was also the chief priest here. They did not need to build a palace to show their majesty. As long as they firmly controlled the Double Peak Temple, all the camel people were willing to serve them. After all, the emperor was not only the direct descendant of the king of Twin Peaks, but also his most loyal servant. Is it news from Gearsang? A lazy voice sounded from the depths of the hall. After a night of conquest, the camel emperor had just woken up. What is that restless guy doing again? Your Majesty, please take a look first. The Danfeng attendant kneeling at the door of the hall took out a folded piece of parchment from his arms, carefully placed it on the conveyor belt, and gently rotated the shaft to send it in. I dare not open this confidential letter sent by His Excellency the Proud this morning. Gearsang was originally related to the Camel Emperor by blood. He was one of the top nobles of the Camel Empire. But later, for some reason, he deliberately provoked a war between the camel people and gathered troops for himself. Although Girsang finally handed over his soldiers under the intervention of the King of Twin Peaks, and the Camel Emperor also agreed to reconcile, how could the rift be so easily healed? Besides, Girsang himself was very charismatic and had many fans among the Twin Peaks noble class. In addition to being a camel god priest, he was also a highly skilled shaman master. With such a person in the center of power, how could the emperor not be suspicious? The Camel Emperor had secretly placed many of his own spies around him, and His Excellency the Twin Peaks was one of them. After reading the report written on the parchment and seeing the papyrus wrapped in it, the Camel Emperor had already believed most of the news that Girsang had found an important material that could simplify the shaman's initiation ritual. His big hand clenched the parchment into a ball. He didn't care about the warm and fragrant jade beside him. He immediately put on the crown and white robe, stood up, and walked out of the bedroom. The servant who had been kneeling outside the temple thought that His Majesty was going to gather the Twin Peaks nobles who supported him. He was prepared to pass on the message, but who would have thought that the Hunchback Emperor would turn into a colonnade that led to another building in the Twin Peaks temple? The colonnade was very long. Even a creature as tall as the Hunchback would have to walk for a while with large strides. The colorful paintings on the pillars seemed to have an unusual divine power. It was able to turn the emperor of an empire, who was drunk and lying on the lap of a beauty, awake and holding the power of the world, into the solemn-looking hunchback god officiant after passing through the middle. The attendant behind the emperor stopped halfway. There was another low-level priest in the other building of the temple, but they were never allowed to cross paths. What belongs to the gods belongs to the gods, and what belongs to the emperor belongs to the emperor. In the distinctly divided Twin Peaks temple, everyone needed to keep this in mind at all times. Walking to the entrance of the temple where the King of Twin Peaks was enshrined, the emperor lowered his noble head. The door was designed to be very short. Even the single-humped hunchback had to bend his knees. This was to remind the hunchback to be humble and polite in front of the hunchback god. Although he had been here many times, every time was the same as the first time. The emperor was always shocked by the magnificent desert scene inside the temple, which was like a small world. Stepping on the dreamy sand, the emperor of the Hunchback Empire first tidied up his appearance again. Then he took the copper pot held by the low-level priest beside him and poured the blood of the taboo sheep into the copper tripod in front of him. My descendant, the blood of the taboo sheep began to boil, but there was no smell of blood. A huge statue of a camel with two humps, which seemed to be carved out of crystal, slowly floated up from the sea of sand. What do you want? The emperor of the Hunchback Empire, the officiant of the Twin Peaks temple, knelt down and prostrated himself on the ground as soon as the god spoke. His lower lip was close to the ground, and he said in an extremely respectful tone, "The spirit of the great ancestors, the bearer of the only two continents in the world, the guide of the hunchback, the ruler of the desert, the noble king of Twin Peaks, your most loyal servant greets you," using concise language. The Hunchback Emperor reported the news that Girsang had found a way to enlighten a large number of elemental shamans to the Hunchback god. The key point of the final conclusion was that Girsang might be planning a war to divide the Hunchback again. Indeed, war will bring about the loss of believers. The Hunchback god's crystal statue suddenly glowed as if it was actively thinking for a moment before giving a reply. At the same time, it is also an opportunity. What do you think of the title of King of War before my many titles? I see. No wonder when Girsang provoked the war, the King of Twin Peaks still did not withdraw his favor to the traitor. No wonder he sent an oracle to persuade the Hunchback god to give up the responsibility. In this way, everything could be explained. This god, who had always been lonely and seeking defeat in the island world, wanted to integrate himself into the priesthood in the field of war. He needed people or conditions to be able to start and participate in the war, so he did not pursue Girsang's previous behavior. Due to the protection of the desert surrounding the area, The war between the demonic fish hidden in the depths of the sea and the Empire fell into a period of probing and observation. The Federation on the thick solid island seemed to be too far away from the Empire. As for the forces of the floating raft people, they could only be defined as villages at most. Conquering villages was not a huge war. The thoughts and behavior of the hunchback god really lived up to the saying, "The ignorant are fearless." He did not know that as the first god of an intelligent race, as long as he plowed deeply and made the race grow, he actually had the opportunity to become a great divine power one day. Rashly integrating into the priesthood of war seemed powerful, but in fact, there were many competitors. For a god who had no foundation and started late, it was very dangerous. What's more, he did not even touch the edge of the weak divine power. At most, he was just a false god. But for the emperor of the Hunchback Empire, the will of the ancestor was an oracle. Although he was dissatisfied in his heart, he would not disobey. At least, he could not openly disobey. The blood of the taboo sheep in the copper cauldron evaporated, and the statue of the hunchback god sank back into the sea of sand. The emperor got up, bowed again, and left the temple. When he returned to the temple that completely belonged to him and symbolized secular power, he immediately summoned his confidants for a secret meeting. Chapter 219. Since he wants war, then let's give him war, the hunchback emperor thought to himself. He raised his golden goblet and gulped down a full cup of butter. It's not a small fight like Gearson's, but a real war. The bloodthirsty war hammer slashed down with a sharp whistle, shining with a dazzling cold light. Its wielder, Zhang Dan, let out an ear-piercing laugh with his black totemic chin. His name came from this wild roar. As his body swayed, his long white hair flew behind his head, and his blood-red eyes shone brightly. Again and again he swung his axe at imaginary enemies, honing himself so that in a real battle he could reduce his enemies to mincemeat under his axe. Wolfgar Berroar roared and spun, controlling the powerful force with great ease with his exquisite technique. Even though this was just a simple practice, he was completely immersed in a state of hot-blooded infatuation. Until a voice called his name, he came back to his senses. Wolfgar. Although he had just undergone intense exercise, the young polar bearman warrior only opened his nose and panted slightly. Controlling one's breathing was also a kind of exercise, and for a warrior, it was as important as learning how to distribute one's strength. He propped the black hammer on the ground, looked up, and saw a familiar elder walking toward him. Lord Berroar. Wolfgar used the tribe's surname instead of the name Fury Bear to show his respect. When the elder came in front of him, Wolfgar took the lead and extended his left fist. Fury Bear clenched his fists and performed the traditional greeting of the polar bear people. Fury Bear then said in a rough voice, "We don't have to stay in this hot and boring capital of the camel people anymore. The Emperor has allowed us to visit the warlord named Gearsan." That's good news. Wolfgar put the war hammer on his shoulder and turned to walk out of the courtyard with Fury Bear following beside him. After confirming that there were no single-humped hunchbacks around to take care of his daily life, the young polar bearman said, "But he must be planning something." Fury Bear didn't refute this, because he knew that even if the Ghost Realm's tricks were waiting for them, the young polar bear chief's son would not give up this opportunity to meet the leader of the pro-war camel people. But that's not important. Any situation is better than this. Wolfgar continued, his black totemic chin pressed into a straight line. "Just like you once taught me, polar bear men can't understand peace without war." Just like the Camel Empire, the Federation was now in a peaceful period of confrontation with the army of demonic fish monsters. As they were of the same race as the fallen walrus people, there were quite a number of walrus people within the Federation who were very satisfied with the status quo. Those guys even managed to persuade a group of polar bear men who were also used to living a comfortable life. As the future great chieftain, Wolfgar felt extremely humiliated. He had publicly opposed this kind of wrong idea of close to direct surrender more than once. Because of his warmongering words, Wulfgar was questioned by many people in the Federation, until he met a walrus chief who dared to tarnish his honor. The young polar bearman warrior directly challenged him to a duel and smashed his skull with a slap. Then, questioning turned into accusations and even condemnation. The agitated walrus people allied with other tribes to condemn Wulfgar and asked the Federation to severely punish the murderer. In order to calm everyone's anger, the polar bear chief whipped Wulfgar in public. But he was his son after all. In the end, he only arranged for Wulfgar and Fury Bear to go to the Camel Empire together, hoping to use distance to eliminate the storm of public opinion. After a long voyage, the polar bearman's diplomatic group arrived at the land controlled by the camel people. Because of his identity as the son of the Federation's great chieftain, Wulfgar quickly met the emperor. Originally, he wanted to use this opportunity to find a reliable ally. But after meeting, he was surprised to find that the Camel Emperor was actually a leader of the pro-peace faction who was content with pleasure. During his stay, Wulfgar learned that the leader of the pro-war faction of the Camel people was a warlord named Gearsan. Due to the Emperor's suspicions, he wanted to visit but was unable to do so. But today, the Camel Emperor actually informed Fury Bear that Gearsan is trading with the floating raft people in a market and generously allowed the polar bearman's diplomatic group to visit the market. Although Wulfgar already guessed that there must be something hidden, he still embarked on the journey to the market. Because they wanted to speed up their journey, the polar bear men didn't ride on the carriages pulled by the cleft hoof bulls. Instead, they walked step by step on the road built by the camel people. The polar bearmen's average height was about the same as the walrus people's. They were slightly shorter than the camel people, but they were stronger. The camel people caravans all made way for them. No one dared to provoke them. With sufficient food and water supplies, the polar bear men traveled like an army for nearly 2 days and finally saw the oasis where the market was before their members were exhausted. We're almost there. Fury Bear held a cowhide water bag and slowly drank a mouthful of water. After a long journey or a fierce battle, although he was thirsty, he had to drink water like this. He handed the water bag to Wulfgar, who was still standing with a warhammer. Have you thought about how to contact Gearsan? Or why do you have to see him? Wulfgar nodded and pointed to the small oasis in the distance. He replied slyly, I'm not going to see the camel warlord that their emperor is suspicious of. I'm visiting the floating raft people market and accidentally met him when I was trading. When he said the word accidentally, the young polar bearman emphasized his tone. Then his face became solemn. He continued to speak to Fury Bear in a more familiar voice. But even so, I think there might be an accident. You have to inform those soldiers to be ready for battle at any time. I think you're thirsty for battle. The chief of the polar bear tribe thought for a moment and still chose to speak his true feelings. Although he had taught Wulfgar to be fearless in battle, the son of the chief was obviously too aggressive. It's necessary to fight with honor, but you can't just live to fight and kill, or Wulfgar interrupted him. The young polar bearman leaned close to Fury Bear's face and stared into his eyes. He said sincerely and without allowing any objection, the polar bear men are a race that likes to fight. Constant fighting has honed our wisdom and toughened our bodies. Without these, we will become weak. Chapter 220. It was raining heavily outside, but the temporary hut made of palm leaves was still dry, although there was some mist. Due to the close proximity to the enclosure where the split-hoofed bulls were kept, the damp air was filled with the smell of a stable. The environment was not too good, but it was still bearable. This is not a trip, Keyes kept reminding himself. He had been here for 3 whole days, and today was the 4th day. Most of the people on the floating raft were still setting up stalls in the heavy rain, hoping to sell more goods in exchange for more soil that did not contain salt and alkali, as well as log for the repair of the circular base. Captain, wearing a bamboo hat made of leaves, Koss hurriedly ran over. The young blue dragon had just asked him to help gather information. Captain Geller said that the ceremony will be held after the rain. Pointing at the logs piled up next to his hut, Quest said to the boy, I don't need that many materials. You can take some and find a way to make yourself a boat that can go out to sea. This was a reward for the accurate information Koss had gathered. The reason why he had stayed here for so long was to see the strange magic ceremony of the camel people in the island world. After the great cataclysm, as the sea level rose, the entire island world's precipitation became abundant. The oasis where the camel people lived in the desert, as it was often nourished by the rain, expanded day by day. In order to resist the expansion of the demonic fish's influence and prevent the amphibious monsters from landing and harassing them, the Twin Peak King taught his camel priests a spell. They used special wood, carved runes, and drew magic circles to make totem poles. These totem poles would be properly placed on the coastal land, absorbing the fertility of the soil, and thus the desert surrounding the empire would appear. The desert was the camel people's natural barrier, and in order to maintain this barrier, the totem poles had to be replaced regularly. The rain came quickly, but it also left quickly. But even so, it still added a lot of vitality to the oasis where the market was. Walking out of the palm hut, Keys took a breath of the fresh air after the rain as he strolled around. Those stalls over there seemed to be new faces. They should be the people on the floating raft who just arrived at the other circular bases. Koss, who was beside Keys, replied, but they don't seem to be carrying a lot of goods. It's a little strange. After hearing Koss's words, the blue dragon in human form couldn't help but size up the group of people again. Soon, he discovered the reason why Koss found it strange. The newcomers were all young men with strong physiques. Keys frowned. There was something wrong with this situation. Generally speaking, considering the trading experience, most of the people who came out of the circular base to trade were people of a certain age. Besides, the goods sold by those people were of little value. They were just dried mussels and salted seafood. There was no need to send some strong men to protect them. Don't run around later, just stay by my side. Keys pointed to the new group of people on the floating raft and quickly told his little follower. Finally, he emphasized, those people are a little strange. Just when Koss, who was confused, was about to ask, the melodious sound of a bone flute suddenly sounded in the market, accompanied by the beating of a bronze drum. The ceremony for the camel people to replace the totem poles had begun. The one who presided over the ceremony was none other than Girsan, the priest of the camel god. The most noble two-humped camel in the oasis was standing next to the totem pole at the moment. He chanted the name of the two-humped king and prayed to him. His fingers, in a specific order, stroked the runes and magic circles engraved on the totem pole little by little. A wave of magic, which was not powerful but was more durable, slowly seeped into the ground under the guidance of Girsan. Because he was very sensitive to magic, Keys soon found that the ground under his feet seemed to be alive in an instant. Accompanied by a slight tremor, the greenery of the oasis where the market was located after the heavy rain gradually faded. The vegetation withered and turned yellow at a speed visible to the naked eye, and a thin layer of accumulated soil once again turned into a desert. The withered area was centered on the totem pole, but the pole itself seemed to be full of vitality. Because it had absorbed the vitality of the land, the totem pole, which had been cut down for a long time and was even covered with paint, had sprouted many tender shoots. Halt! Outside the market came the soft shout of a camel guard. Thanks to his sharp hearing, Keys heard it very clearly. He looked back in the direction of the sound and saw a small group of polar bear men. Knowing that the camel people were holding a ceremony, Wolfgar and Fury Bear were not annoyed by the guard's obstruction. They led the Bearmen delegation and stood quietly at the entrance of the market, waiting for the ceremony to end. Although they had been trekking for 2 days, this group of abnormally strong polar bear men still maintained a good spirit. In contrast, the single-humped camel people who blocked them with halberds and axes were slightly thin and weak. It's a pity that we're one step too late. We didn't see how the camel people cast magic, Fury Bear thought to himself. In addition to being a powerful warrior, the chief of the Bearmen tribe was also a polar bearman elemental shaman who was good at controlling thunder. Therefore, he felt a little regretful that he did not have time to see the unique magic ceremony that only spread in the Camel Empire. It did not take long for Gearsan to complete the ceremony of replacing the totem pole. A brand new totem pole was planted into the ground again, and the original totem pole that had grown roots and sprouts was carried on his shoulder and brought back to the wooden house where he lived. Only then did the polar bear men get permission from the camel guards. Under the surprised and gloomy gazes, they strode into the market. Originally, Wolfgar planned to stroll around and buy something while looking for an opportunity to contact the leader of the pro-war faction of the camel people. But who would have thought that there would be a sudden change? The person who made Koss and Keys find strange suddenly launched a sneak attack after the polar bear men stepped into the market. Some took out a blowpipe that was already filled with poisoned fish bones. They immediately aimed at the polar bearman's body parts that were not covered by armor and shot. Some took out hidden stone knives. They were not afraid of the difference in size between the target and themselves. They charged forward and attacked at close range. Some were responsible for creating chaos. They loudly spread rumors that the polar bear men were killing people on the street and incited the other people on the raft to attack them together. Damn it! After seeing one of his tribesmen get hit in the eye by a poisoned blowpipe, he was caught off guard and had his throat slit in a panic. Wolfgar was instantly enraged. He swung his warhammer and sent the assassin who was pestering him flying. Chapter 2:21. The chaos that had lasted for half a day had subsided. Dusk was fading, and the sky was darkening. Everyone in the bazaar was staring at the flickering orange bonfire. After the two polar bear men were killed in a sneak attack, the enraged son of the great chieftain took them down one by one with his war hammer, literally. Regardless of the difference in martial arts and equipment between the two sides, just considering the disparity in size and strength, this was the best they could achieve. Other than the occasional sobbing from the people on the floating raft from the circular base, everyone was silent. A row of corpses lay on the ground beside the bonfire. Two polar bear men, half a dozen single-humped camel guards, and dozens of humans. The first to break the heavy atmosphere was the captain of the single-humped camel guards. He is the only son of his family. His son was just born not long ago. Geller pointed at his men lying on the ground and counted them one by one. You are not stepping on the thick, solid island. How dare you commit murder on the imperial soldiers on this land? Bear. As the questioning voice became louder, his knuckles on the halberd in his hand became more and more pale. The surrounding single-humped camel guards also silently gathered around with their weapons, ready to listen to the captain's orders. Just as Geller was about to pull out the halberd from the ground, an old but powerful hand stopped him. Gearsan came over and put his hand on the camel captain's hand. We've killed enough today. There's no need to add additional battles. The old two-humped camel did not just stop his compatriots. In fact, his gloomy I had been staring at the polar bear men who were ready to fight at any time. Sir Gearsan. Fury Bear stepped out from the crowd and stood in front of the young warrior with a fierce look in his eyes. The polar bear men are never afraid of battle, but we are not bloodthirsty. He looked back at the silent Wolfgar, and the great chieftain's son nodded at him. I admit, the camel warriors may have been killed by my compatriots. Fury Bear pointed at the collapsed chest of the guard and continued. But at that time, our diplomatic mission was attacked for no reason. The camel guards rushed over with weapons and wanted to stop our self-defense. Self-defense? This time, the one who spoke was an elderly human. Grieving over the death of his son, the bursar elder of the circular base no longer cared about his fear of the powerful polar bear men. It was another group that ambushed you, but you attacked the innocent. 23 of us died, 10 times more than the casualties of the polar bear men. He retorted with a sobbing voice. What right do you have to speak here? Unexpectedly, the person who reprimanded him was not a polar bearman, but the young noble of the Hunchback, Twin Peaks. But he immediately shut his mouth again. Although he had passed the initiation ceremony, Gearsang's cold eyes still made the apprentice instinctively feel awe. Fury Bear looked at the Twin Peaks who helped him to retort, but he quickly locked his eyes on the bursar elder. Sorry, but while your grief does not seem fake, it was you who attacked us. Even if it was not that tense situation, we could not tell the difference between your different tribes. He paused and thought for a moment before continuing. Besides, how can you prove that those people are not members of your tribe? If there is no way to verify it, we may have to apply to His Majesty, the Hunchback Emperor, to arrest all of you. One by one, we will interrogate you carefully. This was not bullying, but the true plan of the polar bearman's chief, come diplomat. Since Wolfgar, the great chieftain's son, was in the diplomatic mission, Fury Bear had a need and an obligation to find out who ordered the assassination and why. He even suspected that what happened today had something to do with the Walrus Man. After all, Wolfgar had killed a Walrus Man chief on Sturdy Island. Bullshit. The Bursar Elder pointed at Fury Bear and roared in grief. He walked to his old acquaintance, Geller, and looked up at the hunchback captain who was much taller than him. Captain Geller, hurry up and tell those polar bear men that those people did not come from the same circular base as us. We are innocent victims, old friends who have known you for more than 20 years. Geller's lips were dry. He could not bear to look down at his old friend and said helplessly, I'm sorry, I can't prove it for you. In fact, the people in charge of receiving you today can no longer stand up for you. They all died in the hands of those people. It's useless and dishonorable. No, there's still a way to prove that we are innocent victims. Hearing the words of the hunchback captain, the Bursar Elder felt as if he was struck by lightning. Faced with a crisis that could affect the entire circular base, he could not care less about the pain of losing his son and said loudly, No, all of us. Anyone who is willing to find out the truth can go to the beach. If there are two circular bases there, it can prove that the attackers are not on the same side as us. Smart. Keyes could not help but secretly applaud the resourcefulness of the people of this island world. It was now high tide, and once the circular base by the sea broke down, it would be difficult to move. If there were two homes of the Bursar Elder floating at the headland, it would naturally prove the Bursar Elder's complaint. Moreover, even if the polar bear men and hunchbacks tried to stop them, there were still boats on the shore that they had anchored before. With the skills of the Bursar Elder, as long as the ropes were untied, there was a high chance that they could successfully escape back to the circular base. By then, neither the hunchbacks nor the polar bear men would be able to catch up, and the people who came ashore to trade would be safe. Of course, the Bursar Elder still hoped to prove his innocence instead of running away in a hurry. Because if he chose to run away, then all the materials that the Bursar Elder had obtained this time would go to waste, and it would be difficult for them to come to the coast of the Empire to trade in the future. I'm willing to go with you. It was Gear San who spoke. He reached out his hand and pressed it on the Bursar Elder's shoulder. Running away won't solve the problem. Sometimes you have to learn to face it. The old Bursar Elder suddenly became nervous, fearing that the other party would ask to keep the hostages. But it seemed that Gear San was very confident in his ability, so he only brought his own apprentices and a few hunchback guards. After the assassination, Fury Bear and Wolfgar were not ready to let their people move separately, so the polar bearmen's diplomatic group followed. After going through so many things, everyone was also very tired. The group all sat on the big cart pulled by the cleft hoof bulls and walked along the road in the desert toward the coast. Captain, using his short stature and the cover of the night, Koss sneaked to the young blue dragon's carriage and whispered, Just now the Bursar Elder made a sign. I'm afraid you can't understand. When we reach the coast, first untie the ropes of the Zhanyan. If the situation changes, run. Keyes said playfully, but there was no change in his tone, but his eyes looked into the darkness on both sides of the convoy. Remember what I said before? Seeing Koss scratching his head, Keyes stopped beating around the bush and bluntly reminded him, When the situation changes, hide by my side. Something strange again? The boy asked in surprise. He almost shouted, but he covered his mouth with his hand in time. The cart pulled by the cleft hoof bulls walked for about 2 or 3 hourglasses, and many people smelled the salty smell and the breeze blowing from the ocean to the land. Captain Geller, who led the team at the front, jumped off the cart and pulled open the deer firewood that divided the beach and the desert. After a while, the sound of turbulent waves hitting the shore came. Everyone got off the cart and walked to the beach on foot. "Teacher, be careful of the sandpit here." Proud Twin Peaks walked in front of Gearsang, testing the way forward for his teacher. "Oh my God, what is this?" His toes stepped on a layer of something slippery. With the help of the torch in his hand, the Twin Peaks noble lowered his head and was about to pick it up to check. "Don't touch it if you don't want to be poisoned." The young blue dragon who walked past them squinted and recognized that it was a poisonous jellyfish. He reminded, "Of course, if you think you can survive, please help yourself." After hearing what he said, Proud Twin Peaks instinctively took 2 steps back and wanted to wield his weapon to cut the jellyfish. But Gearsang stopped him. The old hunchback buried him with a handful of sand with his toes. "To deal with danger, you have to use your opponent's skill." After saying this, Gearsang took a deep look at Keys, then ignored the stunned apprentice and strode to the beach. Most of the boats that the people on the floating raft took were docked at the wharf. A few of the boats that were originally docked at the shore were fixed by anchors because of the high tide and drifting on the sea. Some people were ready to go to the boats on the shore, but several polar bear people followed behind them and did not have the time to untie the ropes. The Bursar elder walked to Gearsang and Fury Bear. He did not know the identity of Wolfgar. He pointed to the 2 large black shadows floating in the distance and said, "The 2 circular bases are there. We are not the same people. He narrowed his eyes before he finished his words. Although it was high tide, the 2 circular bases were too close to the shore. Is the stone anchor loose? Or is it stranded?" An explosion came from behind the crowd and interrupted the Bursar elder's thoughts. A firework suddenly shot up and leaped into the sky, bursting into bright sparks on the curtain of the night. "Be careful. It's an ambush." The captain of the camel people, Geller, immediately reacted and called his men to rush toward Gearsang. "Protect the master and go first. I'll cover the rear." After that, he waved the halberd in his hand and aimed it at the Bursar elder who led them here. Chapter 222. Topulo never thought that he would receive such a reader's letter in his lifetime. When you receive this letter, please don't be too surprised, although you will definitely be like this later. 2 days later, on the West Hammer coast of the Camel Empire, at the location marked below, there will be a meeting between the Federation's Wafgar, son of the polar bear chief, and the Empire's Gearsang, double peak aristocrat, first shaman of the camel people. If I were you, I wouldn't miss this news. It should rain that day, which is a good weather for a sneak attack. Signed, a cold reader who has read your poisonous works. When it finished reading the words on the pottery tablet, a special spell was suddenly triggered. The pottery tablet that originally carried the words and pictures turned into fine sand and scattered on the bottom of the deep sea. Although this powerful and ancient demonic fish of the 7 Guilds Council had completely memorized all the contents, it still felt a little disappointed. It lost an important evidence and couldn't prove to the other demonic fish that its previous plan had succeeded. Decades ago, in order to attack the land, Topulo came up with a brilliant idea that was completely different from the other 7 Guilds' demonic fish's search for a more suitable source of soldiers. After a lot of effort, this demonic fish used its tentacles to hold the carving knife and wrote a work called Topulo's Daily Life on the clay tablet. There was no trace of magic or psionic power on it. It was to spread the cultural invasion to the land ruled by the Empire and the Federation through the sailors who luckily escaped. But who would have thought that whether it was the polar bear or the camel people, the parchment they used to record the words was so expensive that Topulo's work had no chance to be passed down to the world. The failure of the cultural invasion caused it to be ridiculed by many of its own kind. That matter had always bothered it. Crawl silently. The demonic fish complained with a vocabulary that it didn't know where it learned from. Suddenly, an idea flashed in its mind. Didn't the letter convey a message? It might as well give it a try. Anyway, even if it failed, it would only lose some monster army. But if it succeeded, new evidence would naturally appear. Ha ha! Topulo laughed wildly, stirring up the deep-sea water and making a meaningless gurgling sound. On the coast, just as the camel guard captain waved his halberd and was about to kill the treasurer elder on the spot, Gearson stopped him in time. The person who released the signal was caught. The old, double-humped camel man pointed to the distance. The man on the floating raft who was about to swallow the poison pill to commit suicide had been captured by Keys. His jaw was dislocated, and the poison pill was removed. Be careful of the surroundings. The enemy has clearly made a series of plans. Blindly retreating will be more dangerous. Gearson's voice. Boom, boom, boom. The camel people's camel people's camel people's camel people's camel people's camel people's camel. The camel, S camel camel, people's people camels ts camel camel people's camels camel man, people's the camel camel people's camel t, have a people's camel. S camel peak. S's S camel people camel people camel people. Out of the way. Wolfgar pushed aside a single hump camel in front of him and swung his warhammer to knock over a split hoof bull running at the front. Then, the son of the polar bear tribe's chief threw the warhammer to the side, grabbed the bull's horns with both hands, and lifted it up. He bent his legs slightly, leaned back, and used the strength of his arms to dance the cleft hoof bull into a spinning top. Go away. After exhaling, Wolfgar threw this beast out and swept away all the other split hoof bulls that were charging at them. They could only lay on the beach and whine. His move to turn the tide won him many cheers. Not only the polar bear people of the same race, but even the camel guards also looked at him with admiration. Only the people on the floating raft did not notice the excitement on this side. They all turned their heads to the sea and looked at the circular base that was gradually accelerating towards the shore, dumbfounded. The circular base neither raised the sails nor lowered the long oars. The power of the waves alone was not enough to move the heavy stone anchor that had been dragged to the bottom of the sea. Monsters! Help! Or we can escape together! The people on the floating raft who were still in the circular base also saw the figures holding torches on the shore and immediately adjusted the wind lanterns. The candles made of fish fat flickered and sent out a special signal. His lips opened and closed as he quickly read the information sent by his clansmen. The face of the treasurer who was standing near the shore suddenly changed. He pulled Gearson's sleeve and pointed at the waves in the distance. He said in horror, "Sir, there, the monsters in the sea are hiding in the waves and pushing the circular base." In fact, apart from them, Quest had also noticed the abnormality under the waves. The fish monsters with toad-like heads and armored monsters with carapaces were hiding under the surface of the sea. They were riding on the waves to quickly approach the shore. They were surging like water rushing into a narrow river, pushing each other and scrambling to be the first. But strangely, they did not make any sound. Obviously, someone or something was directing their actions. Get ready. Before Gearson could say retreat to the desert, the ground under everyone's feet suddenly trembled. Near the edge of the beach, the sand collapsed out of thin air. A few huge sandworm heads popped out and then retracted. They were not responsible for fighting. A large number of monsters came out of the tunnels dug by killing the worms. After identifying the direction, they immediately charged at the people gathered on the shore. The captain of the camel guards, Geller, was the most familiar with the place. He immediately said to Gearson, "Sir, there is a cliff over there. There is a temporary outpost of the Empire on it. We can take advantage of the danger and hold on for a while." In the face of a life-and-death crisis, everyone's execution efficiency would be greatly improved. Even if they did not ask others to move together, when the camel people began to run along the coastline, the polar bear people and the floating raft people immediately followed. In order not to expose the dimensional storage equipment he carried, Keys deliberately got on the ship and took out 2 long swords and a spear hidden in the hidden compartment when they ran past the berth of the Zhang Yuan. He then caught up with the fleeing team. "Take the weapon." Keys stuffed a long steel sword into the hands of Koss. The little boy wanted to wait for him, so he was at the end of the team. "You won't have a chance to use it when you're with me. Hold it tight when I'm not around." Seeing the steel weapon the young blue dragon took out, a few of the floating raft people running beside them showed a look of envy. But Keys immediately used his unfriendly eyes and the weapon in his hand to intimidate the greedy ones. There was a loud creaking sound behind them. It was the sound of the two circular bases running aground one after another, followed by the wailing of the monsters. Everyone could not help but look back and saw a wall of fire burning around the circular bases. Many monsters that wanted to attack the circular bases were burned by the sudden flames. That's the last defense measure. The burning fuel is made of stored whale oil and seaweed oil. The boy also looked back and said to Keys worriedly, "It's very powerful, but the stored fuel can only last for a day at most. It should be fine as long as we can hold on until dawn." Keys pointed to the polar bear people running at the front of the team. He just heard them call Wolfgar. Those guys have a strong background. Maybe they can find a way to get help. Koss was skeptical. However, the boy definitely couldn't do anything about it. The cliff was not far from the place where they had evacuated. At least with the advantage of their height and long legs, the camel people ran for a while and reached the outpost mentioned by Captain Geller. The polar bear people were not bad. Although their legs were not as long as the camel people's, at least they had a strong burst of power in short-distance sprints. Their endurance was also good, so they arrived at the outpost almost at the same time as the camel people. Compared to these two races, the floating raft people's physical fitness paled in comparison. Their teams stretched out as they ran, and some of the old and young at the back were almost overtaken by the monsters behind them. The camel people and polar bear people who arrived first had already moved out the garrison supplies in the outpost and set up roadblocks with rolling stones. Looking at this situation, if the floating raft people and the monsters were too close, they would probably be attacked indiscriminately. "Hold the sword in your hand, and remember to roll when you land," Keys reminded Koss beside him. He lifted his neck and gently threw him forward. The boy instantly passed many of his people who were still running and landed in front of the team. Seeing that he was still looking back at him, Keys anxiously shouted, "I'll cover them. I'll catch up later. I can finally relax my muscles and bones." Seeing Koss run forward with the floating raft people, the young blue dragon turned his head to look at the monsters chasing after him and said casually. With a swing of his left hand, Keys used the steel longsword as a dart and directly threw it to the nearest fish monster. He didn't pick up the weapon. Instead, he used the spear in his other hand and stabbed it diagonally behind him, killing an armored monster that was preparing to ambush him. That floating raft person is very strong. Standing on the edge of the cliff, Wolfgar looked down from time to time. While helping his people fix the rolling stones with wooden wedges, he said to Fury Bear, who was doing the same job, "Compared to me, he might even be stronger." His people had tied the rope that made it easier to remove the wooden wedges, so Wolfgar did not need to use his shoulder to hold the rolling stones. He did not continue to set up the defense facilities. Instead, he focused on admiring the battle below the cliff. Chapter 223. Not a single one of them can fight. Wielding his spear, the young blue dragon displayed the three key points of blocking, seizing, and stabbing vividly. The upper part of the spear attacked the enemy's head, throat, and eyes. The middle part of the spear attacked the enemy's chest, wrists, and abdomen. The lower part of the spear specifically targeted the lower 3 points. From time to time, he would block the enemy that pounced in front of him and deliver a swift and fatal stab with the back of his hand. Although most of the monsters that chased after him had natural armor, they could not withstand Keys's Megalosaurus power, his fierce martial arts that specialized in attacking the vital points, and the weapon in his hand that was made of high-quality steel. After playing with the monsters for a while, he lost interest in continuing to fight personally. At this time, the people on the floating raft had also climbed up the cliff, and Keys was naturally happy to retreat with them. Picking up the long sword that was still stuck in the body of a devilfish monster, he took a few steps forward. Borrowing the speed of his spear, the young blue dragon directly leapt over the heads of the monsters that wanted to surround him. After repeating this a few times, Keys jumped to the bottom of the cliff by the coast. Following the narrow and straight path, he quickly climbed to the vicinity of the basically well-established defense facilities. "Watch your step," A half-squatting hunchback guard poked his head out from behind a short wall that was temporarily built and reminded loudly, "Don't step on those planks, they're all traps." Many people had seen the young blue dragon's elegant demeanor when he stayed at the back of the team to block the enemy. No one could deny that he was a powerful warrior and also an ally. Even if he was not a hunchback or a polar bearman, for the sake of the future battle, they could not let him suffer meaningless harm because of the traps now. Originally, the hunchbacks had planned to throw a few ropes so that Keys could swing over from the cliff by the side of the path, but he directly used the method he used to break through the previous time. Using his spear to tap the ground, he easily jumped over the traps and into the fortifications. Because this was a sentry post to guard against the invasion of the demonic fish forces, it was naturally equipped with a fire beacon and smoke signal as a means of communication. Although the smoke signal could not be used in the dark, the fire beacon was already useful. 3 long, straight poles, usually used as masts by the rafters, stood in a triangular formation at the top of the cliff. Under the action of the pulley, a shallow stone plate tied by a copper chain was raised to the top of the mast. Inside, there were several layers of pine wood placed in a staggered pattern. The gaps between the fuel were filled with sawdust and shell powder. After igniting, it emitted a red flame that spread far and wide. The signal for help had already been sent out. Now it all depended on whether the people guarding this outpost could hold on and wait for reinforcements. Other than Keys, who had already proven his strength, and Koss, who had been gifted a long sword by him, the other people on the floating raft weren't given any weapons. They could only take on the task of transporting the garrison equipment. Perhaps it was because this place was originally a sentry post. The camel guards had stocked up a lot of pine oil and rolling stones to deal with the attacks of monsters, as well as a considerable number of whip arrows. Whip arrow, as the name suggested, was a weapon made of a wooden pole and a leather belt that looked like a whip. The user quickly rotates the belt and uses centrifugal force to project. This kind of weapon was somewhat similar to a stone catapult, except that it fired a special kind of arrow. Due to their height and long arms, the camel people were quite proficient in using this kind of weapon. Those who were good at it could even fire 2 or 3 arrows at the same time. Although whip arrows weren't as accurate as ordinary arrows, their firing speed was quite impressive. Moreover, with the camel people's endurance, as long as there were enough arrows, it wasn't difficult to continuously rotate the whip arrows for several hourglasses. A dozen or so camel people could continuously rain arrows down from the sky. It was the most suitable way to deal with groups of demonic fish monsters. But in this defensive battle, the first thing to show its might wasn't the whip arrows of the camel archers, but a barrel of pine oil. It was a flammable liquid made of distilled turpentine, oil, and other resins. It poured down from the top of the cliff and was immediately ignited by the defenders. A group of demonic fish monsters that were climbing up the path couldn't dodge in time. Most of them were smeared with the flaming oil, letting out waves of heart-wrenching cries. They instinctively wanted to retreat, but they were pushed by the other monsters behind them, blocking the path that was burning with flames. There was no room for them to retreat. If that gourmet brew was here, he might have invented a new dish: grilled fish in turpentine oil. Not long after, a strange grilled fish smell reached the young blue dragon's nose. The first batch of monsters died in the sea of flames, but it didn't let the people guarding the cliff post relax their vigilance. A few races had fought with demonic fish monsters for hundreds of years, so they knew that they weren't afraid of a battle of attrition. The monsters that followed became smarter. They began to dig some mud from the bottom of the sea and smear it on their bodies. Although they couldn't resist the flames for a long time, they could at least hold on for a while. Wave after wave, after 4 or 5 rounds of the seafood feast, the dozens of barrels of pine oil stored in the post were all used up. But the number of monsters that besieged the post didn't decrease. They were still advancing dauntlessly. Moreover, without the obstruction of the flames, they climbed even harder. Regardless of whether it was the webbed toes of the demonic fish monsters or the appendages of the armored monsters, they were all looking for rocks that weren't too hot to land on. They were sprinting to the top of the cliff at their fastest speed. Release. When a vanguard of the monsters was about to reach the top, Fury Bear, who had been observing the situation below, suddenly roared. With this order, a polar bearman immediately pulled the rope and pulled out the wooden wedge fixed onto the rolling stone trap. Gurgle, gurgle. A huge stone with a diameter similar to that of a polar bearman rolled down the path down the mountain. Under the influence of gravity, potential energy was converted into kinetic energy. The rolling stone accelerated its rotation and rolled toward the army of monsters that once again crowded the path. Like a rapidly spinning bowling ball hitting a bowling pin, or like a road roller rolling over newly laid asphalt, the heavy rolling stone rolled down the cliff, leaving only a ground of minced meat and broken limbs. Looking at the mess left behind by the rolling stone, the army of monsters that continued to charge at them without regard for their own safety, Gearsan pulled over the human on the floating raft that had been captured by Keys. After completing the mission of delivering the message, he resolutely wanted to commit suicide by taking poison as soon as possible. Such a resolute attitude was impossible for a mercenary recruited temporarily. He must be an elite death warrior cultivated by a certain force or someone who had spent a lot of time to cultivate. Speak. Who ordered you to do this? Gearsan's fingers clasped the captive's shoulder and gradually squeezed into the flesh. He was looking forward to an answer, but he was somewhat conflicted with his own thoughts. Federation force? Demonic fish? Or the Emperor? Despite the pain that made him twitch, the captive was very stubborn and didn't say a word from beginning to end. On the contrary, after Gearsan exerted his strength, he felt an unusual touch on his fingertips. A piercing sound was heard. Gearsan took out the ritual dagger from his waist and cut open the captive's fishskin short shirt. Only then did he realize that the man's shoulder blades were sunken. In addition to the holes that his fingers had poked, there were also several natural cracks. A human with gills? Chapter 2:24. He still had some doubts about the man on the raft he had caught before. Now it seemed that whether he was a human or not was still up for debate. Even if he found that the man had gills on his shoulders, it was not easy to conclude that he was sent by the demonic fish. The demonic fish was a creature that pursued pragmatism. If they, who dominated the sea, found that the men on the raft could be turned into excellent subordinates, why would they sneak into the ash world to plunder more powerful species that were more suitable for the desert environment? So this weirdo with gills on his shoulders was very likely to be a basin of dirty water splashed on the demonic fish. And the subsequent attack by the monsters completely confirmed this suspicion. Perhaps more than that. The indescribable darkness is hidden in the depths of the sea. Looking at the stern Gearsan, the captive had a mocking look on his face. He turned to the rest of the men on the raft and said loudly, "Only by accepting the gift of the sea can we better survive." He reached out and gently lifted the man's jaw, and the jaw that had just been reattached fell off again. We don't have time to listen to his nonsense. Fury Bear, relying on his size, squeezed past several hunchback guards and stopped Gearsan's interrogation. No matter what they know, the polar bearman bared his fangs and glared at the captive with a ferocious look. Or what they want to hide, we have to wait until this battle is over and we can survive. As the chief of the Bearman clan, Fury Bear was obviously not a brute with a brain full of muscles. In fact, he was also very curious about what was hidden behind the continuous changes. The attack on the chief's son was obviously deliberately prepared, but if it was only based on those forces, it was not worthy of his evaluation of the word deliberately. Since the person who planned the attack could accurately know the time of their arrival at the trading market, could it not be possible to estimate the actual combat power of a diplomatic mission composed entirely of polar bear men? Did they just send some men on the raft to launch an assassination and let them come here to die? There was no way for anyone with a normal IQ to not be suspicious of the series of accidents that happened today. However, now is really not the time to pursue the mastermind behind the scenes. Fury Bear stared at Gearsan and then glanced at Twin Peaks, who was standing behind Gearsan and glaring at him. He said calmly, "Some of the defensive equipment here has been used, and the rest can only stop the sea monster gate for half an hourglass at most. After that, how long we can hold on will depend on you and your apprentices, and how much spell support I can give the warriors. There is no need to finish the rest. Fury Bear believed that Gear Sand would understand that if they could not get reinforcements, or rather, if the reinforcements they hoped for did not exist at all, then there was no point in trying to find out more about the conspiracy. Then let them out first. Walking out of the protection of several camel guards, Gear Sand seemed to have made up his mind or remembered something. A dozen papyrus scrolls appeared in his open palm. I think we can hold on for a long time. After chanting the incantation, several papyrus scrolls floated up at the same time and unfolded in the wind. The magic circles and runes that were originally drawn on the paper all changed. Some were directly ignited, some were erased, and some were torn into pieces. Several elemental creature summoning circles were triggered one after another. This kind of scroll was more complicated than the elemental summoning circle that Gear Sand had experimented with before. Previously, the elemental shamans could only use totem poles as carriers and carve them bit by bit. But after a few days of practice, Gear Sand summed up the method of drawing the magic circles on papyrus, and everything became simple. In just a few days, he had made and stocked up a considerable number of magic scrolls. Of course, he also found that every time he successfully made such a magic item, he would permanently lose a part of his elemental spirit affinity. Although he could slowly make up for it through cultivation later, it would indeed have a certain impact on the creator. And except for a shaman master like him, the success rate of ordinary elemental shamans making magic scrolls was not high. If they failed, they would also lose a part of their elemental affinity, which was not worth it. Therefore, after stocking up on some magic scrolls, he did not continue to make them. However, at this time, the dozen or so papyrus magic scrolls did help Gear Sand and the others a lot. Because the steps of chanting the incantation and preparing the casting materials had been completed in advance before the completion of the scroll, he only needed to open the scroll and activate the incantation with a few syllables, and several elemental creatures that had already been contracted responded to the summoning. "Drive and kill the monsters below the cliff," Gear Sand ordered. In fact, he also knew that there was no need for any words. The summoned creatures would understand the summoner's intention. The camel shaman wanted to send a message to the guards. They had a powerful shaman behind them. The water elemental in the shape of a camel jumped directly into the sea below the cliff, and the waves in this part of the sea suddenly subsided and receded. The large and small monsters that were lying in the sea to recuperate and ready to take turns to attack were horrified to find that the water in their bodies also flowed out uncontrollably with the receding seawater. And the fire element and the air element, like a group, merged together. The wind borrowed the strength of the fire, and the fire enhanced the power of the wind, rolling and sweeping to the bodies of the fish monster and the armored monsters, plowing the ground crazily. Not good. Gear Sand, who had been stabilizing his mind and communicating with the elemental creatures he summoned, suddenly frowned. The water elemental was dispelled by the demonic fish behind. In fact, he did not see the creature that dispelled the water elemental. But according to the experience of the land races fighting with the monsters under the command of the demonic fish, there were few monsters among them who could cast spells. At most, the armored monsters were more sensitive to spells. Most of the ones who could cast spells were the young, demonic fish warlords who had been hiding in the sea behind the monsters and commanding them. Gear Sand's guess was both right and wrong. There was indeed a demonic fish that dispelled the water elemental he summoned, but this demonic fish was not a young warlord, but a member of the Seven Gills Council, Topulo. In addition to ending the trouble caused by the water elemental creatures, this fish was eager to verify the accuracy of the reader's letter so that it could show off the success of its previous plan to its companions. It also added an additional coral golem to help the army of monsters. "Go ashore. Drive those guys off the cliff." Topulo ordered his golem. A creature composed of sharp coral stepped on the seabed with its 4 thick coral legs and staggered forward. Although it looked very slow, with his 20-foot long legs, he was able to cover a large distance with each step. Four hollow coral arms covered with sharp, colorful sawtooth stretched out from its core. While paddling to speed up its speed, a star-shaped wheel-like object slowly grew at the top of the arms. The function of these wheel-like objects was immediately revealed after the coral golem's arms emerged from the water. Buzz, 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 buzz. For almost overlapping whistles cut through the night sky. Even if the garrison at the top of the cliff was enduring the abuse of the fire and air elemental creatures, and the noise made by the army of monsters, they could not ignore such an abnormal and ominous sound. Stop those flying discs! As it had never seen such an attack, Fury Bear's roar-like order stuttered a little. But this did not affect the others' obedience to the order. In anyone's opinion, the white flying discs that flew over quickly were not as simple as a greeting. If they were hit, even the thick-skinned polar bear men would have their bones broken. Clang! A crisp sound rang out. Wolfgar grabbed the halberd of the hunchback guard beside him and threw a flying disc in the air. Not only did the halberd immediately break, but the flying disc that was hit deviated from its direction. Even though the force was hindered, it still penetrated deeply into the cliff. Ignoring the hunchback guard's initial shock and then anger, the son of the polar bearman chief saw the power of the flying disc and immediately gave up the idea of using the warhammer in his hand to block another flying disc. He found a right time and suddenly jumped up. With the mountain-splitting strength posture, he smashed the flying disc with the warhammer and used the speed and strength of the flying disc to embed it into the rocky ground at the top of the cliff. Fury Bear, who was standing near Gearsan, also used the same method of throwing the halberd to deal with a flying disc. The last flying disc flew toward the floating raft, people who were constantly transporting defensive supplies. The two polar bear men who had the ability to stop it were indeed unable to do anything. Unsurprisingly, this frisbee was Quith's help to solve the problem. He held the end of the spear with both hands, lowered his body, and used a downward thrust, hitting the center of the flying disc. The spinning disc and the tip of the spear rubbed against each other, making a piercing sound. The young blue dragon was speechless. He was definitely not deliberately showing off his martial arts skills. It was really a pure coincidence. But just like the principle of an arrow on the string cannot be released, Keys could only use his arms to exert strength. He swung the spear in a circle above his head and sent the flying disc back the way it came. Coincidentally, it hit the arm of the coral golem. Although it didn't directly cut it off, it still smashed this super large golem that was more than 20 feet tall. Fortunately, it didn't flip sideways onto the beach. Everyone, including Wolfgar who had been paying attention to him, looked at Keys with a lot more respect in their eyes. Good job. As the chief of the bear clan, Fury Bear naturally commanded many battles. He knew very well how to motivate his subordinates. For a moment, the morale of all the people on the cliff who were waiting for reinforcements was greatly boosted until the coral golem that had regained its balance launched another attack. Its limbs that were inserted into the sea continued to absorb the seawater, which was transmitted and compressed from its hollow body into a kind of water cannonball. It was guided and aimed by its arms and quickly fired. Bang, bang, bang. The 3 consecutive water cannonballs directly hit the elemental creatures that were raging at the bottom of the cliff. The air elementals were fine, but the fire elementals that were hit by the water cannonballs were directly annihilated and lost contact with Gearsan. The remaining air elementals began to seem a little powerless in the face of the army of demonic fish monsters with carapaces and scales. Chapter 225. In Keys's view, the war mode of the island world was rudimentary. Not to mention the bloody airdrop battlefield that he had experienced. Even the strategy, tactics, and various technical means used in the annihilation battle against the Japanese invasion were much more advanced than those in the island world by more than 10 chong in streets. For example, the camel shaman just summoned an elemental creature to attack the opponent. In addition to being powerful, it was extinguished before it could cause too much damage to the enemy. Even a simple hammer and anvil tactic could not be used. After little calculation, Keyes found that this team of more than a dozen polar bear men and more camel guards, in almost the same amount of time, did not kill as many monsters as the gladiators in the Taka Grand Arena. Although the gladiators had a higher proportion of steel weapons, they also did not have a set of bronze plate armor like the polar bear men. And there was almost no difference between iron and bronze for blunt weapons such as warhammers. In fact, if the user was strong enough, heavier copper weapons would be even more lethal. Furthermore, excluding the unarmed and relatively weak rafters. In fact, the polar bear men and hunchbacks did not take any extra care of them and were not a burden at all. The group with so many powerful warriors had no intention of breaking out of the encirclement, nor did they have any intention of charging back. Instead, they chose to compete with the numerous monsters in a war of attrition and blindly waited for reinforcements. In fact, this already explained the problem. With such a level of command, the demonic fish did not take down the land races, and it was really due to the geographical factors that played a big role. Perhaps this was also the reason why Jerson and Fury Bear had immediately agreed when Captain Geller suggested retreating to the cliff outpost. "It's a habit," Quest commented silently in his heart. Then, he looked at the coral golem that was gradually approaching the cliff after destroying the fire elemental creatures and the air elemental creatures with water cannons. Passively taking a beating is not a good habit. As if to confirm his thoughts, the coral golem immediately fired at the top of the cliff when it was close enough. Bang! 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 3 water cannonballs whizzed out. For the shooter who did not know how to control his gun, 3 consecutive shots would not disappoint. Although 2 of the water cannonballs hit the rock wall, the 3rd water cannonball successfully hit the target. A hunchback guard who was crouching behind a low wall and was vigilantly watching the monster army that was surging forward again was hit by a water cannonball. Visible distortions appeared on the body of the camel man. His torso and at least one of his arms were fractured. He only had time to let out a cry of pain before his heart was pierced by a rib and he died. "Be careful," Girseng shouted. The camel shaman immediately crouched down, placed his palms on the rocky ground, and began to chant an incantation. After a few breaths, giant finger-like stone pillars extended from both sides of the cliff, protecting everyone in the middle. Keyes reminded himself, as he carefully sensed the magic waves that brought about changes in the terrain. Is this a divine spell? The coral golem continued to bombard the top of the cliff with 3 consecutive shots. As a constructed creature, it naturally wouldn't feel tired. But firing high-pressure water cannonballs did consume some of the energy stored in the core, and it could not squander it indefinitely. After the water cannonball attack failed, the coral golem decisively gave up this method of attack. It broke off some star-shaped fragments from its body and used its 4 arms to throw them out. It was somewhat similar to the frisbee that was launched at the beginning, but the star-shaped fragments were much smaller than the frisbee. Naturally, their strength was not comparable, but there were more of them. "Is this called flower rain?" Keyes whispered as he used a spear to push away a few coral darts that slipped through the gaps of the finger-shaped rocks summoned by Girseng's divine spell. Screams of pain came one after another. Many of the people at the top of the cliff were hit by the coral darts. "Damn it!" Girseng continued to chant the spell to summon the stone pillars. More stone pillars grew and blocked the gap left by the previous attack. But in this way, it was difficult for them to observe the situation on both sides in time, and this was exactly the purpose of the coral golem. It suddenly changed from limping to taking small steps. Every time it took a step, there would be a burst of ear-piercing, creaking sounds. Boom! 2 of the 4 arms of this constructed creature heavily hit the cliff wall. Remembering the master of the demonic fish, the coral golem began to climb to the top of the cliff. In order to cover the golem, the monsters at the bottom of the cliff also began a new attack. Relying on their shells, the armored monsters rushed up first. "I'll deal with the golem." Seeing the critical situation, Fury Bear immediately said to Girseng, "You go and stall the monster army." After that, the chief of the bear tribe first stared at the eager Wolfgar. "Polar bear men, fear not." Fury Bear roared like thunder, his upright body quickly leaned forward and landed on all fours. Although he was also an elemental shaman like Girsang, this polar bearman spellcaster obviously took a different path. Just like his name, Thunder Roar, Fury Bear always had the habit of adding the power of thunder to himself and then delivering the angry roar to the enemy at close range. At the same time, he would also add the bite and claw attacks with the power of thunder. A storm suddenly formed above the cliff with Fury Bear as the center. His white hair fluttered in the wind. Lightning flashed in the sky, and the corresponding sparks jumped on the polar bearman's claws. Then, with a crack, a bolt of lightning shot forward, not from the sky, but from between the sharp claws of Fury Bear that had become thicker. Rolling thunder, Fury Bear, with all his hair standing on end, followed the trajectory of the lightning. With a light leap, he flipped over the wall of stone pillars summoned by Girsang. Even when he was falling, he used all four of his limbs to push against the rock wall and accelerated again, pouncing on the coral golem. Thunderclaw. As Fury Bear roared again, a bolt of thunder suddenly blasted from the tip of his claws to one of the coral golem's waving arms. The arm that was trying to block the polar bearman suddenly exploded, and the other three arms supporting the cliff almost lost their balance. The lightning refracted 3 times on the coral golem, causing 4 violent explosions. Some parts connected to the core of the golem's torso were even smoking. This golem was obviously heavily injured. Without the obstruction of the arm, Fury Bear smashed hard on the coral golem. Supreme roar, wild rage, like the last straw that broke the camel's back, the polar bearman shaman's iron palms with the power of thunder fell one after another, and the branches on the core of the coral golem continued to shatter and collapse. Finally, with the sound of a cable snapping, the coral golem's other arm that was inserted into the rock wall also broke. The huge golem fell directly from the sky, smashing a shallow pit, and shattered into pieces. At the last moment, Fury Bear used his sharp claws to hook onto the rock wall and was now struggling to climb to the top of the cliff. Aside from him, the battle on the front was also in full swing. Taking advantage of the coral golem's previous offensive, the armored monsters and fish monsters also approached the defensive position. The first armored monster stepped on the flipboard trap, and its body was pierced by a wooden spike that flipped over, and blue blood spilled out. "Release the arrows," Girsang shouted. This camel warlord was quite familiar with military matters. Try not to let them get close. More than 20 camel men were divided into 3 rows. They raised the long poles of the whip arrows, and with the help of centrifugal force, shot the arrows out. Many of the people on the floating raft relied on their short stature, compared to the camel men, to constantly shuttle between the camel archers formation and were responsible for holding the bundles of whip arrows that were already attached to the archers' hands. Without the need to change the arrows themselves, with the camel men's endurance, these archers could continue to shoot for a long time. Some of the arrows that were shot out directly penetrated the bodies of the monsters, and some were blocked by the carapace and scales. At this time, Captain Geller, who had been observing the momentum of the monster's attack, played a role. He could always find the right moment when the monster's attack was thwarted and command the polar bear men or camel guards to pull out the wooden wedges and release the rolling stones in time, clearing the entire path up the mountain in one go. There are no more rolling stones. When the last rolling stone was released, Geller immediately turned his head to report to Girsang. According to previous experience, in about 30 breaths, those monsters will attack again. Girsang pulled his apprentice. The proud Twin Peaks had just been initiated as an elemental shaman not long ago, and had not mastered many spells, so he had not made any achievements before. Use what you have learned to block a wave of attacks. He pointed to the fine steel halberd in the young Twin Peak noble's hand. Whether it is martial arts or shaman spells, you can do it. I need some time. I will prove myself. There was no shirking. In fact, as a Twin Peak noble, he could not refuse. Whether it is strength or courage, I deserve the glory of a Twin Peak noble. Lifting his feet and stomping on the rocky ground a few times, the proud Twin Peaks added stone skin to himself. After jumping out of the front line, he went straight to the monster army that was waiting under the cliff. Just like how Quest brought up the rear, he didn't rely on martial arts, but brute force and stone skin to increase his defensive power. The young Twin Peak noble brandished his halberd, unleashing a peerless flurry between the monster fish and the armored monsters. This is a one-on-one. Looking at the endless battle scene, the young blue dragon, hiding on the cliff, sneered in his heart, and was even more certain of his previous judgment. The battle in this plane is like a chicken pecking at each other. Maybe. Chapter 226. Maybe I was too gentle just now. Topulo pondered. He immediately felt the fall of the coral golem. Losing this big toy made the demonic fish a little distressed. As a demonic fish with 7 pairs of gills, Topulo had many ways to make up for the previous wrong decision. Just as proud Twin Peaks was fighting to prove the honor of the Twin Peaks aristocrat, Gearsan also prepared his own spells. Through communicating with the elemental spirit, the camel shaman combined the power of the elements with the priest's divine spells. He recited the spell that gave vitality to the elements, but his fingers drew a mysterious trajectory according to the teachings of the Twin Peaks king. Galloping Rock, Earth Spirit Guard, a granite boulder about the same size as the rolling stone pushed by the guards appeared out of thin air and quickly rolled down from the top of the cliff. Get out of the way. Gearsan quickly issued an order to proud Twin Peaks. The latter immediately jumped out of the cliff path and hooked the rock wall with his halberd. The granite boulders crushed the monsters one by one, breaking their formation into pieces. Even when it finally came to a stop on the beach, it was still spinning nonstop. With a cracking sound, the granite boulder suddenly exploded. Stone fragments and shards shot out in all directions, injuring many monsters nearby. Arms and legs stretched out from the boulder. The elemental spirit had adapted to the body of this material plane. The galloping rock turned into an Earth Spirit Guard and continued to fight. The Earth Spirit Guard didn't roar, and its appearance was not ferocious. Instead, it looked a little simple and honest, but its killing was simple and efficient. Push, block, smash, and press. Just 4 actions, used repeatedly, broke the bones of many fish monsters and made many armored monsters overturn their carapaces. Some monsters wanted to push it down and limit the attack of the Earth Spirit Guard in this way, but its limbs were basically the same. The moment it fell to the ground, its hands turned into legs. It continued its previous actions and launched an efficient attack again and again. Other than that, there was already a hazy orange glow on the horizon. The glimmer of dawn once again boosted everyone's morale. Someone should be here soon. Fury Bear, who had climbed up the cliff again, gently pushed away a polar bearman warrior who was trying to help him. He walked up to Gearsan and pretended to be calm as he asked, "After all, the beacon has been lit all night. Even a blind man should have seen it." Gearsan wanted to say a few words of comfort, but the rocky ground under his feet began to shake, and his legs stumbled. Red, loud, and ominous lightning tore through the sky, accompanied by darkness, not light. "What's the matter?" Over the rumbling thunder, Gelsang shouted to Fury Bear, knowing that the other man knew the storm better. "There's nothing wrong with the sky." The polar bear elemental shaman stretched out his palm and felt it. "I'm worried that..." The earth trembled again, and the sky flashed red. Fury Bear's words were interrupted. A terrible, ear-piercing sound of friction came from the ground, colliding with a shrill whistling above the clouds. The ground shook more and more violently. Whether it was the defenders on the cliff or the monsters below, all of them staggered and lost their balance. Many of them knelt on the ground. Gearsan also staggered, but he tried to straighten his body. Drawing strength from the surging elements, the camel shaman continued to cast spells. Hurry up and rush down the cliff. Mixed with incomprehensible slang and curses, the people who were desperately guarding the cliff began to run down the path to the bottom of the cliff. The dust composed of rock debris and monster wreckage hit the crowd. They did not even have time to cry, and the monsters who could not even take care of themselves due to their swaying did not have time to attack. This Helping Gearsan, who was the last to walk down the cliff, Fury Bear pointed to the large shoal formed by the rapidly receding sea and asked in surprise, "Should we now?" He wanted to say, "Should we immediately organize a breakout?" After all, the surrounding monsters were still eyeing them covetously. But immediately, the polar bearman was stunned by the next scene. He tried to communicate with the elements to understand the situation, but the violent and disorderly response of the elemental spirit made his brain shut down immediately. "Run!" Keys pulled Koss, who was beside him, and pointed to the tall, broad-leaved plants that grew on the shore, similar to coconut trees, and said, "Climb up the tree and hug it tightly." At the place where the sea and the sky met, the water line that had been dyed red by the rising sun gradually rose and rushed to the shore at a speed several times faster than when it had just retreated. It turned out that the previous earthquake was just an omen of this great tsunami. At this time, the initiator of this disaster was hiding deep in the sea, constantly laughing. The demonic fish, Topulo, was also running away. In fact, although it could trigger a tsunami of such a scale, it did not mean that its body could withstand the tearing of the great force of nature. However, compared to the creatures on the shore, it only needed to retreat into the deep sea to avoid this danger. After that, it could send servants to follow the direction of the offshore current to find their targets or directly to find their corpses. This kind of remedy for the previous decision was really straightforward. Unlike the hunchback, polar bearman, and floating raft people who desperately fled inland, the monster army that was abandoned by their masters desperately fled in the direction of the sea. For them, before the monstrous waves hit, they could only escape the tsunami by hiding in the deep sea in time. Therefore, the two sides that were fighting for life and death just now had no time to fight at this time. Instead, they opened up the distance between each other. "Don't run." Looking at the approaching waves, Gearsan shouted loudly, "Climb up the coconut tree and hug it tightly." The hunchback shaman was smarter. He took off his robe, went around the trunk, clamped a thick coconut tree trunk with his legs, and quickly climbed to the top of the trunk. The other hunchbacks were not so smart. Some were even injured by the falling coconuts from the shaking tree trunk. Polar bear men were naturally good at swimming, so they did not immediately climb up the tree. Instead, they began to undress under the tree. They removed all the bronze plate armor that might be a burden and put it aside. "I will never leave my weapon." Wolfgar ignored Fury Bear's dissuasion. After taking off the bronze plate armor, he immediately carried the war hammer on his back and climbed to the top of the tree. There will definitely be a battle soon. As for the floating raft people, they did not quarrel or fight with the hunchback or polar bearman for the tall coconut tree. Because they were much lighter than the other two races, they were often able to hide in a coconut tree with several people. Furthermore, some of the more astute ones would use their belts to form a rope, binding the people who were close to each other. Just stay there. Seeing that the waves were about to hit, and there were still hunchbacks who could not climb up the coconut tree, Gearsan immediately shouted, "Hug the trunk tightly. Try not to." The waves still covered the head of the hunchback shaman, even though he had already climbed to the top of the coconut tree. In an instant, the waves took away the right to speak for these land races. As for the right to live, it was only a matter of time before it was taken away. The proud twin peaks hugged the tree in front of him tightly. His brown skin was bloodless, and his eyes were closed. His noble attire, black footwear and pants, together with the linen shirt, it was soaked and stuck tightly to his skin. However, he was still not the most overwhelmed group of people. The waves were sometimes high and sometimes low, so they would not always be under the water. But the lungs that were pressed by the seawater could not breathe. Especially the hunchbacks who had no experience in breathing underwater, they would always inadvertently drink a large mouthful of salty seawater. "Hold on." Seeing that some of the camels had let go of the tree trunk because they were drowning, Fury Bear took advantage of the break in the waves and roared at his compatriots. "This tsunami won't last long. The waves will soon be unsustainable." As if to slap him in the face, before Fury Bear's voice died away, a huge wave of nearly 100 feet came crashing down. "Kacha! Kacha!" Gotcha, because there were too many excrements attached, the coconut trees on the coast were broken by the waves one after another. For a time, many people fell into the waves. Their cries for help sounded for a moment, and then they were swallowed by the following tide. Captain Koss, who was hugging the top of the coconut tree firmly, motioned the young blue dragon to look at the sea. His voice was filled with horror. The circular base was torn apart by the waves. Those planks and sailboats are rushing towards us. The two circular bases that were originally pushed to the shore by the monsters were all broken into pieces after a few waves, whether it was the one where Koss belonged or the one where the long-cheeked rafters lived. In order to slow down the corrosion of the seawater, many of the wood that made up the circular base were coated with tar. In the turbid and dark seawater, the black wood was not conspicuous, but it was very dangerous. Many of the polar bear men, who had taken off their bronze plate armor, had pieces of wood stuck in their bodies after a few rows of waves. In addition to the pieces of wood, the ships that were originally anchored inside the circular base were also washed up by the waves. Many people could have held on for a while by hugging the trees, but they were directly hit by the heavy ships and fell into the waves. Zhang Yuan, even without Koss' reminder, Qi saw the small boat that he had brought from the Ash World. Thanks to the sturdy teak planks nailed into the shape of scales and the filling of the cracks with asphalt, the small sailboat had not been largely disintegrated or damaged in the Great Tsunami. Except for the mast that was broken by the waves, the rest of the hull was very intact. And the Zhang Yuan, which had broken a simple anchor, was coincidentally crashing into the coconut tree where Keys was. Have you learned how to jump? Keys asked Koss about a simple naval combat technique. After getting an affirmative answer, he immediately said, "I'll count to 3, 2, 1, and we'll move to the Zhang Yuan." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.